The best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hayes Reviews. Indeed, yes, we are back. We're continuing our live reading tonight of Fearful Master by G. Edward Griffin. And it is very good to be here talking to you, live streaming once again. It is Tuesday and it's 7 o'clock. So that's what we're doing and that's why we're here. I hope you are all well. If you're tuning in live for the broadcast, very warm welcome to you. And if you're watching on the replay, please remember that there's a pinned comment underneath the video and you can use that to jump ahead. It's got timestamps in it and you can move to whichever part of the reading you would like to. If you don't want to hear me rambling on at the beginning, you can get straight to the good stuff. Tonight, the plan is to cover off 3 chapters. I've added it up. I've looked at how many pages there are, and I think we should be able to get through it. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Not too much to mention or talk about in the intro tonight. I did have another conversation with Nigel Watson. That was last night, in fact. That was last night. Sorry, it's been a long day today, so my time is all messed up. I had a conversation with Nigel Watson last night, and he put that up on his YouTube channel today. That was very interesting, very fun. We went back and forward about the contents of the book that we're reading, what we've learned about the UN. Is it really a powerful organization that we should all be scared of? What's its real purpose? And that was good. He made a very cogent point about technocracy and how the real agenda that we're up against that is being rolled out is technocracy. It's one of digital control. It's one of gradually shifting everything we do into this sort of online world. And, you know, it makes me think of recently I hired a car. And when I went to hire this car, it was all digital. I didn't sign anything, any paper document at all. And all the signatures were done on little tablet devices and with my finger just scribbling in a box. And every single time I did that, I had to sign this document maybe 6 or 7 times. Every single signature that I left on those documents was a different squiggle and looked nothing like my actual signature. You know, if you have a pen and a piece of paper, you can replicate your signature over and over again with tiny variations. But for the most part, you know, there are handwriting experts. You can forge signatures and you can, you know, interpret even aspects of people's psychology and personality based upon their handwriting. But all that's going away. Now it's all digital. It's all wiggles on a screen, ones and zeros. And it's very strange because it's not more convenient. It's not more, if they have to prove in court that it was me who signed that, well, anyone could put their finger on a smartphone screen and wiggle some scribbles on there. So it's kind of strange, the world we're heading into. And this is technocracy. And that's the point that Nigel was making, was that it's not really, a lot of people are going around saying, oh, it's communism and there's all this neo-Marxism rolling out. And, that's an element of it. That is one of the vehicles that is out there. It's one of the isms that we're handed to and that is given to us. But I think when you step back and you really get informed and you take in Richard Grove's work on Grand Theft World and Jay Dyer's work, for example, his analysis of geopolitics, when you take in Anthony Sutton's work, the Wall Street trilogy, when you read Tragedy and Hope, for example, with the Cutting Through the Matrix book club, you start to see a bigger picture whereby the communists, the socialists, the capitalists, the bankers, they're all working together. They're all sort of tendrils of the same octopus. And I have to credit Alan Watt for that image, because I was listening to one of his blurbs last night and he was talking about how the octopus has tendrils everywhere in all our institutions all over the planet. It does not recognize borders. It is not of one nation. It is not of one religion. It is not of one creed or race or nationality. But it has tendrils everywhere, and it has one central head somewhere. And who are those people, and what is that head? It's a minority. They exist all over the place, and I think we would probably be shocked to find out that it's a very small group of psychopaths who are brainwashing and mind controlling and forcing the masses to sleepwalk into this system of digital control known as technocracy. So that was a great point that Nigel made. And then we talked a little bit as well about people's reactions to what's going on. And Nigel thinks there's more pushback than I perhaps see and witness. But then again, I'm quite an introverted person. I don't socialize too much or go out all the time. So I'm not out on the street interacting with lots of different people day in, day out. That might be a good exercise to run, to actually get out there and talk to more people and see, okay, what do you think about the events of the last 4 years and what's going on in the present day, and how are your attitudes shaping up with regard to your future and your plans for your life, especially younger people, because they're the target in all of this. It's really an agenda to get young people used to having no privacy, to having everything digitally stored and tracked and traced and databased, so that they know nothing else, because they grew up with it, because it's been normal, because they were given a smartphone as a child, and perhaps their parents had apps on it where it would track them and see where they went, and their parents could call you at any time of any day, and you didn't really have any freedom or time to yourself to just explore and be wild and do crazy things, because you had this device in your pocket where your parents could always keep an eye on you. And that's sold to us, well, safety, isn't it? It's the safety of our children. Now we can make sure our children are even safer than they used to be. But it's really not for the benefit of the families, the parents, and the children. It's really for the benefit of the controllers. It's for the benefit of the people who run the corporations and the governments and the banking institutions and all these sort of corporate type structures that we exist within. Because don't forget, all of these structures are corporations. When you get down to it, legally, they are all money-making corporations. When you look at it on paper, they are there to bring their offer to the market, and they employ all manner of tactics to lie and deceive and trick you into consenting to contract with them and to consenting to use their services and take their offer that they've put down on the table. And I think what a lot of people forget is that you don't have to take these offers. You can build relationships and build alternatives outside these systems. It just so happens that not many people have the energy and the time and the focus and the determination and the persistence and the grit to do that, And so as technocracy is being rolled out, my kind of feeling is that children are just for the most part, sleepwalking right into it. But Nigel had a different point of view, and he says that there's pushback. There is some anger among young people because of the way they've been treated over the last 4 years. I would say that anger is well placed. I would say, and I said on the comments under the video that I hoped that anger led to some research, some education, some reading, some learning to get to grips with these kinds of agendas. What is their history? Where do they come from? Have they been known about for a long time? The kind of thing that we do on this channel to bring it home and to wrap up my introduction. So that conversation is over on Nigel Watson's YouTube. I've also been putting out some more short clips. They've been going up on my YouTube channel under the shorts section. They are kind of sub 1 minute clips from the live stream. So if you want something that is a little short, sharp and snappy, you can share it around, give it a like, add a comment to it, and that's a nice way to spread awareness of the channel and the work that we're doing here, because it would be good if more people could get this information. I think I was watching a great video earlier this week from Jack Spirko, who runs the Survival Podcast. An incredible guy, incredible source of knowledge and life experience and information. He's the real deal from my point of view in terms of being an entrepreneur, because he's got his podcast and he's got his businesses and he's farming, and he's putting out really useful information with regards to food production, with regards to preparing for shit hits the fan scenarios, let's say. And he was talking about the top 10 real dangers of AI. And that was a fascinating conversation to listen to him talk about this, because he was saying how AI, these software, these programs, what is being termed AI, which I don't think it is intelligence, but it's very powerful, algorithmic software that can crunch a lot of data and can produce near realistic video and audio at this point. What he was saying was this AI is going to get so good that it's going to know so much about every single individual that it will be able to tailor make propaganda to deliver to each individual in exactly the right time, in exactly the right place, to get people on board with a certain worldview or a certain narrative that is out there, which is pretty scary, because at the minute they can pump the messaging through the television, but you can just turn the television off and go about your business. Everyone sees the same thing when they switch the television on. Well, or they did when they introduced the television, because there was 3 channels, and then it went to 4, and it was like, oh my God, we have 4 channels. Now there's, I don't know, thousands and thousands. But that trend of more and more options of television channels that's going to keep going and accelerating, and it has accelerated to the point where we all open up and flip open our smartphones now and look at what we see on the screen, and we all get personalized information and a personalized drip of media and sound bites and clips and suggestions and recommendations which are tailored to us. And every single swipe, every single click, every single share, every like, dislike, comment, all this stuff feeds into this data collection monster, which is never full, a ravenous, hungry ghost. And eventually there's going to be such a massive data collected on each of us that the propaganda will be targeted to each individual person. And it will be incredibly subtle, and it will be incredibly difficult to tell what is real from what is fake, whether that's video footage of an event or something that's going on. I think people don't realize how unstable and shaky and how much unreality there's going to be out there, and how hard it's going to be to know what to believe when it comes to our internet usage. And so my solution and my offer, and what I try and do on this channel, and what I try and tell people to do, is grab yourself a bunch of books. They're solid. They can't be edited in real time. They can't be memory hold. Many of them, which we still have access to, still lying around in secondhand bookshops all over the place, are written pre-internet, back when you had to actually do some digging and refer to materials and archived documents. These things are historical artifacts of value, I think, at this point in history. I would say all books to a certain extent. There's going to be something in it, even if it's like a trashy novel that was written in 2010 or earlier, maybe, let's say 2000 or 1990, it's going to capture something of that time and that place in it. Something of the zeitgeist, which is now gone, because things are rapidly accelerating and changing, and it's just one thing after another, after another, after another. Every day we wake up and we're in a totally different world than we were the day before. It's exhausting and it's tiring. Books are something physical that you can hold on to, a bit of an anchor. You can, if you get yourself a good book collection, it can be a kind of anchor into reality. If you gather some of the writings of the minds of the past, the greatest minds of the past who came along before and analyzed the nature of societies and human beings and offered some solutions on how to live and how to deal with troubles and difficulties and strife. I'm thinking perhaps of the Stoics, for example. Stoic philosophers could be something that'd be worthwhile having as we move forward into the strange times and the strangeness and the unreality that we're heading into with regards to AI, propaganda and production of video and audio and all this kind of thing. So get yourself some books. How many times do I have to say it? I'm just going to keep saying it. Or instead of getting yourself some books, you can just continue tuning in to watch me read my books to you. So that is probably a good place to wrap up the intro and actually get on with reading some books, isn't it? So I'll just give a shout out to people in the chat. Welcome. We got Frank, Bitcoin Mining. We got Johnny Fogg, Elizabeth Kendall, Gwen Weston, and we've got Enfuego as well. So I'm very happy to have you here. First time you've caught a live show. Nice. Well done. 7 o'clock. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, my friend. But it's very good to have you here. You've been chewing through the Fabian Freeway books and putting those bookmarks in there. And so I'm very happy. And I think, are you almost caught up now with the Fearful Master videos? I noticed you put some bookmarks on there as well. You got to be listening to them at 1.5, if not 2 times speed. But well played and good to have you here. Over on Odyssey, we have ESP. And I don't think we have anybody in the Rumble chat at the moment. That's all good though. So, good to have you here. Johnny says, 1984 was a novel they can still be telling. Yeah, 1984, Brave New World. Actually, I just got in the post today my cheap edition of George Orwell's Animal Farm. This is the cheap edition that came out 5 years after the original was published. The first edition copies of this are extremely pricey, and I could not justify the expense. So I got a cheap edition, which was much cheaper, as you can imagine. I'm going to be reading that and discussing that with Melissa, who is running the Cutting Through the Matrix Alan Watt channels in various places. That's the plan for next month at some point. I'm going to be having a conversation with her about that book because I've never read it, believe it or not. So yes, Johnny, exactly. Novels can have a lot of information in them. In fact, sometimes people write novels to tell you something that they can't tell you because perhaps they are bound to secrecy. For example, here in the UK, we have the Official Secrets Act. And people who work in, MI5, MI6, these sort of agencies, they can't tell you what has gone on, but they can write fictional novels. Okay, so then this is when you get into like the John le Carre type novels, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Constant Gardener, right? That's a good film as well as a good book telling you all about the corruption and the covering up of the poisoning of African people by these big pharmaceutical companies, for example, and the experimenting and rolling out of drugs over there to the detriment of the local people who they're testing on. So a lot of truth can be communicated through fiction, which there might not be a safe route to get it out through the realm of nonfiction, right? So yes, definitely stock up on books. You might want to skip over the really trashy stuff like 50 Shades of Grey and whatnot. But the classic books, worth having a copy of them. There's that list, isn't there? Is it the 50 greatest books or the 100 greatest books or something of the Western world? I forget the number, but that would be a good set to have. I know that there is one set within my family. I don't have it, but I do know, a family member who's got it. So I'm glad to know that those books are over there, the great books of the Western world. So yes, you can get your novels and your fiction, but I think we're actually heading into a time now with the arrests that have been going on in the UK, with the clamp down on what you can and cannot say, the clamping down on wrongthink, on criticism, of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. It's getting into 1984 kind of territory now. We're getting into Gulag Archipelago type territory of the police are coming after you for thought crime and pre-crime. And so it might be a good idea to gather some of these books, maybe build a secret compartment in your house to put them in. I hope we don't get to that point. But you never know. So Gwen says Aristotle has something to say about tyranny. There you go. Get some Aristotle books on and preserve those. And, you know, you can find it in the philosophy sections of used book shops. You can usually grab the classics. Adam's here saying hello. Well, saying hi, but hello back to you, Adam. And Heidi's here on Rumble as well, having a bit of listening on your break. So I hope you're having a good day, working hard and enjoying yourself. And I think that's a hello to everybody who's in the chat. So we're going to crack on with tonight's reading, which, as I mentioned already, is going to be 3 chapters. So we finished we finished the first 3 parts of the book now, and we are heading into part 4. The last part of the book was all about psychological manipulation of the American public to go along with their continued involvement in the UN. And Ed Griffin gave us a lot of examples of how American politicians were speaking up and saying, we need to leave the UN. This is not a good deal for us. The UN is not what it says it is. It's infiltrated. It is being used to spread socialistic and communistic ideas, collectivist, in other words, which, as we know because of our Fabian Freeway reading, and as Nigel Watson rightly pointed out, just means technocracy, technocratic control, ruled by scientific elite. That's all it is. It's all one and the same thing. That's what the UN is pushing. There were warnings, but these warnings are never referred to. They are not talked about very often. Instead, what you get is a steady drip, a steady diet of all the pro-UN stuff, all the wonderful things it's done, all the fantastic ways that it's helping people and preserving nature and raising awareness and indoctrinating young people to not identify with their nation, because that's yucky and that's a source of lots of evil and lots of terrible nationalistic violence and chauvinism, and we need to breed that out of them. We need to get rid of that, right? And instead we need to replace it with loyalty to the earth, the globe, humanity as a whole, as one species, one animal that needs to be herded and kept under control by the technocrats. You know. So the psychological weapons include children's books, of which I have an example over here that we'll get to once we finish reading this book. Quite an eye-opening few chapters with a lot of tabs that I put in here, with a lot of quotes as well from UNESCO itself. And just before the live stream, I was looking up a document called that Ed refers to, and it's called Towards World Understanding by UNESCO. And he says in his footnotes that there's at least 10 volumes of this publication, Towards World Understanding by UNESCO. Okay. Now, if you try and look for this publication and you can find it for sale, get it, because I can't find it for sale anywhere. I can't even find PDF or electronic copies of this. The only thing I can find is on Amazon.co.uk. When you type in Towards World Understanding by UNESCO, it has a 1st of January 1949. It has an item that says it was published in 1949, Towards World Understanding by UNESCO, unknown binding. It says it's currently unavailable. And that's all it says. There's nothing on eBay. There's nothing on bookfinder.com. I can't find this thing anywhere. I can't find evidence that it existed. So I haven't looked for too long, though, I'll be honest. Sounds like it's been memory holed, or Ed Griffin just made it up. And if he did make it up, shame on you, Ed. But if it is real, some incredible quotes in there, really telling about how we just need to prize children away from their nation, and it was saying that children get a sense of nationalism and patriotic pride from their family. So we need to get between the child and their family and indoctrinate them with some proper ideas of one world unity, of globalism, of peace. It's basically the lyrics of the John Lennon song, which was played at the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony and at the most recent Olympic opening ceremony as well. For some reason, there was a piano that was on fire, floating down a river in Paris, and a woman singing "Imagine" by John Lennon. And imagine no countries, imagine no religion. This is basically why this is the anthem of the one world, new world order, one world government technocratic system. Because all the borders are broken down, everything is homogenized, everything is uniform, everything is under control, perfectly under control. There's no individual community identity or cultural identity. It is all just Starbucks and McDonald's and working on your laptops, pushing pixels all day, and that's that. Imagine. And that's basically the indoctrination that children are getting and that we were learning about in the last few chapters. But tonight, we are on part 4, the final part in this book, which I think will take us tonight and maybe Thursday's reading to get through, because it's not too long. We've got about 70 pages left now. And so, with that said, let's get right into it and continue with chapter, what is it? Chapter 16? Sorry, chapter 14. All right, we'll go to the book cam. We're going to do 3 chapters. And I think we've got another bunch of pictures to look at as well. Because we've been very lucky, and G. Edward Griffin has been very generous in this book and supplied us with a excellent helping of pictures to flesh out the context and give some life to the events and the situations described, which isn't always a good thing, because some of the situations described in this book are pretty grim, particularly in the case of Katanga and the UN's involvement there. But anyway, it can't all be sunshine and rainbows, can it? Although I think the UN does like rainbows. They're probably on board with the clownfish and the rainbow people. All right then, chapter 14, A Substitute for Victory. And there's a couple of quotes at the top. The first is from General James A. Van Fleet. This says, quote, "If we must again send our sons abroad to fight for freedom, I hope they go unshackled, that no appeases chains bind their arms behind their backs." And another quote here from General Mark Clark says, quote, "In carrying out the instruction of my government, I gained the unenviable distinction of being the first U.S. Army commander in history to sign an armistice without victory." And this reminds me as well of an earlier part where J. Edward Griffin was talking about how the UNESCO and UN programming had worked so well that by the time the American soldiers who went off to fight in the Korean War were there and were being sort of captured by the other side, were putting in reports saying these soldiers have no sense of patriotic loyalty, no sense of loyalty to their families or their religions or their culture. They're easy to turn to our side. And that's partly to do with the breaking down of the patriotic sentiment within people and telling them, oh, you just belong to the earth. And it's a bad thing to be loyal to your country. And it's a bad thing to be proud of where you are from and to know your history and the struggles that went on to get to where you are today and to protect that against people who want to break it down and destabilize it. You know, you terrible far right extremist, you. Okay. One of the most famous quotations of the Korean War is General MacArthur's, quote, "There is no substitute for victory." But MacArthur was removed from command for wanting to translate this philosophy into action, and a less well-known quotation became the prevailing American policy. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who set the new pace when she said, quote, "One of the most painful lessons we have to learn is to adapt ourselves to the kind of war which ends without total victory." Until the United States became a member of the United Nations, of course, we had never fought a war that ended in anything except victory. And we could easily have achieved victory in Korea if it had not been for our unnatural subservience to foreign interests. Since the Korean War is often cited as one of the outstanding achievements of the UN, it is worth our while to take a brief look at a few of the less obvious aspects of this tragic affair. In 1947, General Albert C. Wedemeyer was sent to the Far East to make an official military appraisal of conditions there. In his report to President Truman, General Wedemeyer stated, quote, "Whereas American and Soviet forces engaged in occupation duties in South and North Korea respectively are approximately equal, each comprising less than 50,000 troops. The Soviet equipped and trained North Korean People's Army of approximately 125,000 is vastly superior to the US organized constabulary of 16,000 Koreans equipped with Japanese small arms. The North Korean People's Army constitutes a potential military threat to South Korea, since there is a strong possibility that the Soviets will withdraw their occupation forces and thus induce our own withdrawal. This probably will take place just as soon as they can be sure that the North Korean puppet government and its armed forces which they have created are strong enough and sufficiently well indoctrinated to be relied upon to carry out Soviet objectives without the actual presence of Soviet troops." This, of course, is exactly what happened, but General Wedemeyer's report was, at Secretary of State George Marshall's insistence, suppressed and denied to both Congress and the public. After we had withdrawn most of our troops in accordance with the United Nations resolution, our Army General Headquarters in South Korea began sending repeated and urgent reports to Washington, warning that there was an unmistakable military buildup just above the 38th parallel. One such report even contained the date of the expected North Korean attack. In spite of these reports, however, and despite the fact that money had been appropriated by Congress for the purpose of building up South Korea's defenses, officialdom somehow managed to stall and delay for over 3 months so that no military equipment, not even ammunition, was delivered to reinforce South Korea. Yet, when the attack finally came, Washington officials pretended to be surprised and taken off guard. One thing is certain. If we knew that the communists were preparing for over a year to attack South Korea, the communists knew it too. That may seem too obvious to mention, yet 9 out of 10 Americans have never considered the possibility that the communists wanted the United Nations to commit the US to fight in Korea. If the communists had not wanted the Korean War, they would not have started it. And if they had not wanted the UN to go through the motions of trying to oppose them, they would have vetoed the action in the Security Council. As part of the show, however, the Soviet delegation had stage-managed an impressive walkout, supposedly in protest over the defeat of a motion to seat Red China. Consequently, when the attack came, the Soviets supposedly outsmarted themselves by not being on hand to administer the veto. But, as we have just stated, the assumption that the communists did not know well in advance that the whole thing was coming is absurd. They planned it. The fact that they were conveniently absent when the issue came before the UN only shows that they needed a surface excuse to refrain from the veto. The actual course of the war is well known by all. Our tiny occupational force had been deliberately kept unprepared for the sudden massive assault. It was overwhelmed, backed into the Pusan pocket, and hovered on the brink of being pushed into the sea. There is no doubt that the communists fully expected to sweep us off the peninsula with hardly any opposition, which would have been quite a prestige builder for them around the world. They would have done it, too, if it had not been for the independent Americanism of General MacArthur and the bravery of his troops. As MacArthur himself recalled, quote, "The only predictions from Washington at that time warned of impending military disaster. Then, too, our ammunition was critically short. General Walker, at one stage, was down to 5 rounds per gun. His heroically successful efforts unparalleled shortages of all sorts constituted an amazing military exploit. Hopelessly outnumbered by the enemy, General MacArthur conceived one of the most brilliant maneuvers in military history, the Incheon landing. It was a daring surprise flank attack aimed at cutting off the North Korean supply lines. It worked beautifully and, as a result, the enemy forces disintegrated and were nearly destroyed. As General MacArthur stated, quote, "By the latter part of October, the capital of Pyongyang was captured. These events completely transformed the situation from pessimism to optimism. This was the golden moment to translate military victory to a politically advantageous peace. Success in war involves military as well as political considerations, for the sacrifice leading to a military victory would be pointless if not translated properly to the political advantage of peace. But what happened was just the contrary." There was early evidence that the North Korean forces were being trained and equipped by the Soviets, and, after the Incheon landing, that the Chinese communists were providing actual combat troops by the thousands. Lieutenant General Samuel E. Anderson, commander of the 5th Air Force, revealed that entire Soviet Air Force units fought in the Korean War for over 2.5 years, quote, to gain combat experience for the pilots. All in all, some 425 MiGs were being flown by Russian pilots. The Soviets never even tried to conceal their part in the war. When United States Ambassador Lodge complained to the General Assembly's Political Committee that Soviet planning instigated the original aggression, which was subsequently maintained by Soviet training and equipment, Vyshinsky, the Soviet delegate, calmly admitted the substance of the charge and replied, "Mr. Lodge is pushing at an open door." In spite of all this, the United States government refused to allow General MacArthur to pursue the enemy across the Yalu River or even to bomb the bridges over which the Chinese communists transported their troops and supplies. The official reason given was to prevent a war between the United States and Red China. The real reason, since we were already in a war with Red China, was simply that the United Nations did not want us to go to obtain a victory in Korea. And we had, by this time, agreed to go along with whatever the UN wanted. The typical view of so many of our UN allies was expressed in the Fabian Essays, published in London in 1952, with a preface by Prime Minister Clement Attlee. On page 31, the author R. H. Crossman says, quote, "A victory for either side in the Cold War would be defeat for socialism. We are members of the Atlantic Alliance, NATO. But this does not mean that we are enemies of every communist revolution. We are opposed to Russian expansion, but also to an American victory." In 1950, when Congress appropriated rather substantial sums of money to carry on the Korean War, and it looked as though we just might start thinking in terms of pressing for a victory, Prime Minister Attlee rushed to the United States to confer with President Truman. His mission was aptly described by the US News and World Report, which stated, quote, "The British government continues to maintain direct diplomatic relations with the Chinese communists, even though Chinese armies were killing British youths. To Mr. Attlee, China's Mao Zedong still is an official friend. He does big business with the British through Hong Kong. British businessmen are accepted in China. The British want to get rid of Chiang and turn Formosa over to the communists. They oppose any move inside China that might embarrass the communist regime. Mr. Attlee still hopes for a deal covering Asia while keeping up the appearance of a fight in Korea." Mr. Attlee was needlessly alarmed, for on November the 16th, 1950, President Truman announced, quote, "Speaking for the US government and people, I can give assurances that we support and are acting within the limits of the UN policy in Korea, and that we have never at any time entertained any intention to carry hostilities into China." When the Chinese crossed the Yalu, General MacArthur instantly ordered the bridges, 6 of them, destroyed by our Air Force. Within hours, his orders were countermanded from Washington. These bridges still stand. In his bitterness, the general exclaimed, quote, "I realized for the first time that I had actually been denied the use of my full military power to safeguard the lives of my soldiers and the safety of my army. To me, it clearly foreshadowed a future tragic situation in Korea and left me with a sense of inexpressible shock." Not only did we forbid our army commanders to fight for victory in Korea, we denied them access to military assistance that was readily available. The Free Nationalist Chinese on Formosa had offered to send between 50 and 60,000 fighting men to push back the Chinese Reds. They were confident that with very little difficulty, a crushing military defeat in North Korea could set off widespread rebellion in Red China itself. The nationalist Chinese would have been a valuable help to our forces in any event, since they had a reason to fight and wanted desperately to get into it. They offered troops, but General George Marshall turned them down because it was not felt that Chiang's troops would be effective, and for other reasons. On June the 27th, 1950, President Truman announced, "I am calling upon the Chinese government on Formosa to cease all air and sea operations against the mainland. The 7th Fleet will see that this is done." We not only denied our own troops in Korea much needed reinforcements, which would have spared us thousands of casualties, but we even sent the US 7th Fleet to patrol the Formosa Straits to protect the Chinese Reds from attack. In spite of these unprecedented self-imposed handicaps, General MacArthur continued to spoil the communist plans. At another crucial point in the fighting, the enemy once again began to fall apart. In the last half of May, they had been driven back 20 miles with casualties estimated at 100,000. In order to save them from complete defeat and to give them a breathing spell, UN Soviet delegate Jakob Malik proposed negotiations for a ceasefire at the 38th parallel. And so, with our forces once again poised on the brink of victory, MacArthur was dismissed and our forward movement was halted. As negotiations began, our representatives carried a white flag into a formal assemblage of armed communists in a spot held by the communists. Pictures were taken and used for propaganda purposes all over Asia. The paper tiger was meekly suing for peace on communist terms. And make no mistake about it, they were communist terms. One of the key issues of the early negotiations was that of a ceasefire line. We had insisted that the ceasefire line be that point where the fighting was going on when all other major agreements had been reached. The communists wanted us to work it the other way around. The compromise, we gave in to their demands. Then there was the matter of ports of entry into North Korea. We insisted that 12 major ports of entry be patrolled by our observers to ensure that the communists were not receiving military reinforcements. The communists said that 4 ports of entry would be sufficient. The compromise, 4 ports of entry. Another issue was whether or not Chinese communists would be permitted to remain in North Korea. We said no. They said yes. The compromise, they stayed. Another major issue was who would supervise the truce. We said the UN. The communists said neutral nations. The compromise, neutral nations. These neutral nations, incidentally, included Communist Czechoslovakia and Communist Poland. As General Parks later revealed in testimony before a Senate subcommittee, this so-called Neutral Nations Commission vetoed inspection trips to North Korea where they could, stalled the inspections that they could not prevent, and practiced outright collusion with the Chinese and North Korean communists to conceal evidence of treaty violations. A UN group, of course, would have been little different. Consider, for example, the performance of the UN Ceasefire Negotiating Committee, which consisted of Iran, India, and Canada. This group finally submitted a proposal to the General Assembly Political Action Committee that the best solution to the Korean problem was to give Formosa to Red China and admit Red China to the UN. Incredible as this proposal may seem, the vote was 50 in favor, 7 opposed, and 1 abstention. Even the United States voted for it. The only delegate present with the courage and the conviction to speak out against the proposal as abject surrender to communist and aggression was Carlos Romulo of the Philippines. Excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze. My nose is itching a bit. John Foster Dulles was, at the time, a member of the United States delegation that supported this resolution. Fancy that. The official reason given for this incredible vote was that we endorsed it in hopes of winning support for another resolution condemning Red China as aggressor. One final tragic glimpse at this new American no-win policy, which was put into practice in Korea, was provided in a Department of Defense press release dated May the 15th, 1954. It described in detail how high-ranking Russian military officers were actually on the scene in North Korea directing military operations. This, of course, was not news, but then the release stated, quote, "They wore civilian clothing and it was forbidden to address them by rank. They were introduced as newspaper reporters, but they had supreme authority." A North Korean major identified two of these Russian advisors as General Vasilev and Colonel Dolgin. Vasilev, he said, was in charge of all movements across the 38th parallel. Another prisoner said he actually heard General Vasilev give the order to attack on June the 25th. General Vasilev had been the chairman of the United Nations Military Staff Committee, which, along with the office of the Under-Secretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs, is responsible for United Nations military action under the Security Council. As we have already pointed out, the office of the Under-Secretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs has always been filled by a communist from a communist country. Just as the Russian delegates had stage-managed a phony walkout in order to provide a surface excuse for not vetoing United Nations action in Korea, the Russian members of the Military Staff Committee had done exactly the same thing. On January the 19th, 1950, General Vasilev stormed out of the Military Staff Committee, supposedly because he suddenly objected to having a representative from National China on the same committee. As the previous Defense Department statement revealed, he next showed up in North Korea as one of the top military planners, directing the war against the United Nations, the very organization he had just a few months earlier served, supposedly in the interest of international peace and brotherhood. Once the war had gotten underway, the Russians returned to their seats as members of the United Nations Military Staff Committee. General Vasilev was not among them, however. He had turned over his position to another communist, General Ivan A. Sgliaro. In effect, the communists were directing both sides of the war. This shocking piece of information was mentioned on the floor of the United States House of Representatives by Congressman James B. Utt of California, and was thus brought to the attention of the American people. For the most part, however, the nation's press played down this news. There's a footnote here explaining, telling us more about James B. Utt. So, Congressman James B. Utt, Congressional Record. On March the 21st, 1960, the State Department issued a formal statement which said, quote, "The United Nations Military Staff Committee had nothing whatsoever to do with the Korean War, and it did not receive any classified military information on this subject. Nor was the Military Staff Committee involved in any way with the direction of the forces in Korea. The United States did submit periodic reports to the United Nations on the conduct of the fighting in Korea, but these reports contained no classified information and were limited to a factual chronicle of events." Incredible as it may seem, the State Department was asking the American people to believe that the UN had absolutely nothing to do with either planning, directing, or influencing its own war in Korea. However, General George Marshall admitted that the hot pursuit policy of the United States of allowing our pilots to pursue attacking enemy aircraft back into their own territory had been abandoned because this policy failed to receive support in the UN. Secretary of State Dean Acheson further revealed, quote, "There have been resolutions of the General Assembly which make clear the course that the General Assembly thinks wise, and the United States is endeavoring to follow the course which has tremendous international support and is not contemplating taking unilateral steps of its own. It is clear that while the United States was theoretically responsible for the military direction of the Unified Command in Korea, in reality we were going along with whatever the United Nations decided. And there's a reference here which is military situation in the Far East. And that's page 3583, if you want to track that down. Secretly directing the anti-communist side in this worldwide struggle is probably the most important single facet of communist strategy. As long as they have a comfortable degree of control over their own opposition, they are perfectly willing to allow some realistic-looking anti-communism to occur. Otherwise, the anti-communist followers would soon become impatient with their leadership and take measures to replace it. But by allowing the anti-communists to go through the motions of fighting the communists and, if necessary, even allowing them a few minor victories here and there, the communist agents within our ranks can be assured that ultimate victory will be theirs. No better illustration of this strategy can be found than by merely observing the pattern of United States history since the 1930s. It was this pattern in Korea that prompted General Mark Clark to state that he feared communists had wormed their way so deeply into our government that they were able to exercise an inordinate degree of power in shaping the course of America. I could not help wondering and worrying whether we were faced with open enemies across the conference table and hidden ones who sat with us in our most secret councils. Here then are the significant results of the Korean War. 1. The war helped Red China solidify control over its people who were becoming ripe for revolt because of famine and harsh conditions. Tyrants have often used war or the threat of war to preoccupy the minds of their restive subjects. 2. The war climate in the United States had a similar distracting influence on our people as well. Many disastrous measures were introduced with little or no opposition because, quote, we must stand behind our government in this great moment of crisis. 3. The United States lost considerable prestige, particularly in Asia and Latin America. We became the paper tiger that could not even defeat tiny North Korea. 4. We needlessly sacrificed tens of thousands of American lives and billions of dollars because other nations in the United Nations did not want us to fight back in earnest. 5. We became further conditioned to the idea of having future control of our military forces under the United Nations. And 6. For the first time in American military history, the United States was not victorious. That's probably a good one to tab, isn't it? Nice little summary there of the 6 key points and the main outcomes of that particular conflict, which I never really learned all that much about, actually, despite having lived in South Korea for a whole year. I didn't really get into history until we all got locked down. Okay. This is what advocates of the United Nations hold up as the UN's greatest single achievement. The whole situation should have appeared absurd even to the casual observer. The communists attacked a peaceful country. The United Nations went through the motions of pushing the aggressor back to his border, but did everything it could to make sure that there was no punishment for the crime. At the conference table, it treated both the attacked and the attacker as respectable equals. It is like having someone enter your home, attack your wife and shoot your children, and when you call for help, the police merely place the intruder outside your house and tell him not to come back. When he breaks in a second time, stabs you in the shoulder and sets fire to your house, the police react by setting up a neutral committee to negotiate your differences. Do we really want this kind of UN justice? Apparently we do. For when South Korean President Syngman Rhee wanted to drive the communists across the 38th parallel and liberate all of North Korea, President Eisenhower wrote to him and said, quote, "It was indeed a crime that those who attacked from the north invoked violence to unite Korea under their rule. Not only as your official friend, but as your personal friend, I urge that your country not embark upon a similar course. While we have been following Eleanor Roosevelt's advice and learning, quote, to adapt ourselves to the kind of war which ends without victory, the communists have done just the opposite. While Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson declare that the United Nations is the cornerstone of United States foreign policy, Nikita Khrushchev boasts, quote, even if all the countries of the world adopted a decision that did not accord with the interests of the Soviet Union and threatened its security, the Soviet Union would not recognize such a decision, but would uphold its rights, relying on force. What an uneven contest it is when one compares that with the utterances of our own United Nations Ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. Quote, every time, as a result of a confrontation of opinion, one of us says, even to himself, I hadn't quite seen it in that light before, or I had no idea you felt so strongly about this, or that's a point I hadn't fully appreciated. Every time we say something like that, even to ourselves, somewhere in this vast celestial electronic board which charts our movements towards or away from atomic annihilation, a little green light flashes and the traffic of man moves an inch away from the point of collision. One can hear the following exchange. Khrushchev, Americans are criminals for having used germ warfare in Korea. Stevenson, I hadn't seen it in that light before. Khrushchev, we will bury you. Stevenson, I had no idea you felt so strongly about this. Khrushchev, Americans are filthy capitalist warmongers. Stevenson, that's a point I hadn't fully appreciated. So this kind of reminds me, just as a side note, of being tolerant and being inclusive and being, what's the other one? Embracing diversity and embracing equality. Because do you tolerate the intolerant? Because if you yourself are tolerant above all else, and you meet an intolerant person and you tolerate them, at what point do you stop tolerating them? You know, like you said, when they move into, like when they set your curtains on fire, when they slap you around the face, when they help themselves to all the food in your fridge, you know, when they start beating up your wife. Like, at what point do tolerant people become intolerant? Because you can't just tolerate everything and pat yourself on the back for being a good person. Oh, I'm such a good person. I let him burn my curtains down and I didn't even say anything. And I haven't seen it from that point of view. You must really not like my curtains. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't like those curtains either. So it just reminds me of that, this kind of, because it's an unfair fight, right? When you are being told you have to tolerate and celebrate the diversity of the world's people, yet you're not allowed to stick up for your own interests and your own cultural identity and your own national identity, because all the other ones around the world need to be tolerated and respected first and foremost before yours can be tolerated and respected, right? So it's the same kind of thing. Same kind of thing as we're getting, I think, in this country, and not just this country, but plenty of other countries around here. What Mr. Stevenson apparently has failed to understand is that when dealing with the communists, every time we move the traffic of man an inch away from the point of collision, the communists then move the point of collision back an inch closer to the traffic of man. In other words, every time we appease them, in hopes that they will now stop acting like communists, they merely consolidate the gain we have granted them and then press forward for more. Give an inch, take a mile, exactly what I was just talking about. In any contest, if one of the parties is willing to fight if necessary to win, and the other states in advance that not only is fighting unthinkable, but also that he has no intention of trying to win, can there be any doubt as to which will triumph? On November the 12th, 1951, General Matthew Ridgway submitted to the United Nations a report stating that about 8,000 UN military personnel had been killed by North Korean forces, many of them defenseless prisoners of war. It was revealed that most of these had been American soldiers who were shot in the back of the head and dumped into mass graves. Many were tortured until they died a merciful death. In some instances, gasoline was poured upon the wounded men and then ignited by hand grenades. When the United Nations General Assembly finally got around to passing a rather weak resolution condemning such practices, it even avoided coming right out and saying that the communists had been guilty of any of them. Yet, in spite of the watered-down tone of the resolution, 16 countries either refused to support it or actually voted against it. General Mark Clark reported there was solid evidence that after the fighting had stopped in Korea and after the prisoner exchange had been completed, the communists still held 944 American soldiers believed to be alive. United States officials who sent these boys into battle in the first place made no formal protest and took no action to obtain their release, nor was anything said about the matter by the advocates of justice and human rights at the United Nations. Finally, the Chinese communists themselves brought the issue to public attention by announcing that 11 American airmen captured in January of 1953 had been sentenced as spies. The Eisenhower administration acted in its usual manner and courageously submitted the fate of these American boys to the United Nations. On December the 10th, 1954, the General Assembly passed a resolution against the detention of the 11 Americans and called on the Secretary General to intercede on our behalf to see if he could persuade the Chinese Reds to live up to their treaty agreements. Dag Hammarskjöld traveled to Red China to plead for the release of American military men being held illegally by a government that Hammarskjöld was doing everything possible to have admitted to the United Nations. It was a perfunctory visit at best. He did not even ask to see the captives or to survey the conditions under which they were imprisoned. Needless to say, his mission was unsuccessful. The following year, the Red Chinese magnanimously released the flyers as a propaganda wedge to be used at the opening sessions of a series of discussions with the United States in Geneva. Instead of pointing out that these flyers never should have been detained in the first place or demanding the immediate release of the hundreds of other Americans known to be still rotting in red prison camps, United States officials hailed the move as a gesture of goodwill and spoke glowingly of the future prospects of easing world tensions. What has happened to Americans? While Khrushchev boasts, quote, "We spit in their faces and they call it due," Adlai Stevenson says, quote, "We must get used to it, we who suffer from having had things our way for so long." While communists around the world shout at the top of their lungs that they are the wave of the future, Walt Rostow, the special assistant to former President Kennedy for national security affairs, proclaims, "The role of the United States in determining the outcome of the world's history over coming decades will, of course, be marginal, and success cannot be assured." What kind of insane urge for self-destruction prompted an American UNICEF official to say, quote, "By working through UNICEF, the US removes the possibility of criticism for any self-seeking ends. UNICEF itself is permitted to take the credit for the accomplishment." Likewise, at the Second General Conference of UNESCO, an American delegate took the floor and said, quote, "I may say for the delegates of the United States and for the National Commission in the United States, of which Mr. Milton Eisenhower is chairman, that the constant effort of each individual is to discover and to determine what is best for UNESCO. The question we ask ourselves is never what is best for the United States, but what is best for UNESCO." In 1904, a naturalized American citizen by the name of Ion Perdicaris was taken as hostage. Ion Perdicaris was taken as hostage in Morocco by a lawless Arab brigand named Razuli and held for ransom. The Sultan, Abdul Aziz IV, was apparently not too concerned over the incident. President Theodore Roosevelt immediately sent a U.S. warship to Morocco and delivered a message to the Sultan that was both short and to the point. It read, "Perdicaris alive or Razuli dead?" Within a very short time, Perdicaris was safely aboard the U.S. warship. 54 years later, a similar situation arose. In Cuba, a bearded bandit by the name of Fidel Castro kidnapped not one, but 45 American citizens including sailors and Marines from the nearby United States Naval Base at Guantanamo. In this case, however, President Eisenhower sent no telegrams, nor did he dispatch any warships to pick up our captured citizens. The United States government, in fact, did nothing, for under our commitment to the United Nations Charter, such an act would have been illegal. In 1904, we had not invented the nuclear bomb, and we had not sent over $100 billion of foreign aid around the world. Nevertheless, at that time, the American flag and the citizens who gave it allegiance commanded and received respect and admiration everywhere. Today, it is not unusual for Americans to receive instead the jeers and taunts of the rest of the world. Our embassies have been burned, our officials have been spat upon, and in the capitals of the world, "Yankee go home" is chanted in the streets. What better proof could there be of the wisdom of General MacArthur's words, "There is no substitute for victory"? There we go. One chapter down. It's hard to make sense of these things. I find it. Sorry, I tried to mute there. Hope that wasn't loud. It's hard to make sense of, but it kind of sounds to me a lot like America was selected for to be defanged, to be weakened, to be demoralized, because the ideas under which it was founded, I don't know too much about American history or the founding fathers, but at least the concepts and the ideas of going your own way, getting a bit of land, turning it over, making it productive, seeking out a new, brighter future where you didn't have to be beholden to arbitrary levels of taxation and theft of the product of your labor, and it had a sort of romanticism to it in a way that was like adventurous, and what they attempt to do with the founding documents, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, etc., where they were trying to limit the influence and the impact that the government would have over the lives of people, I think was very admirable. I don't know how true or real, or if it ever happened, or how, I'm just saying, because of the lies of the last 4 years, I tend to not take anything for granted or assume anything is the way I've been taught it is. But one thing is for sure is that people don't enjoy very much freedom in the world. And I think freedom is under attack and has been for a very long time. And at least the idea of going somewhere and, planting your flag in a bit of dirt and saying, right, I'm going to work this and keep some animals and build a house and start a family, and we're going to live here and we're going to be self-sufficient. That's freedom, right? And all the risk that comes with it and all the danger and everything, that is something approaching freedom, where you get to build, live where you want to live, do what you want to do, and you're not getting interfered with. And we can sort of see, as time's gone on, the building and the creation of these organizations, the bloating out of the bureaucracies, because not only like in this chapter we're just reading, not only is America dealing with the American government, then you now have also another layer, which is the United Nations over the top of it. And it seems like through the course of this book, at least, that we're finding that the United Nations, in many cases, prevented the American people from benefiting, from doing what they would have done, what the government would have done, had they not been beholden to this UN agreement, this commitment, and this charter. It seems like it had a bias built into it, like a teacher who has a favorite pupil that always lets that pupil get away with things and punishes all the other pupils really harshly, right? The way Ed Griffin describes it, there is this clear and palpable bias in the UN in favor of socialistic, communistic type systems and governments. And, I wonder if that's largely to do with the fact that they are technocratic and atheistic, by nature and scientific and materialistic by nature. If the sort of people who run the thing, make these high-level geopolitical decisions, they want a system that is atheistic and materialistic and scientific. They don't want people connected to God. They don't want people who have a strong religious, I shouldn't say religious, maybe spiritual or religious, but what I'm getting at is people who believe in God and a higher power and a life beyond this life tend to have high esteem for the good qualities in life, right? They don't see each other as an animal that you can just exploit and abuse and throw away when you're done. They're more likely to see each other as sovereign beings created in the image of God, with a soul and a spirit, with intrinsic value just because they're human beings, right? And they tend to want to hold themselves to a higher standard. Part of Christianity, at least, is to confess the things you've done wrong, that you're not very good at, that you're ashamed of, the mistakes you've made, and to strive and earnestly want to become better. And not only want to become better, but to actually take action in the direction of improving who you are and the way you interact with the other people around you, and the way you do business, maybe the way you take care of your family members, whatever it is. All of that stands as a sort of an obstacle to a top-down scientific, atheistic, technocratic, materialist system, which just sees human beings as a herd of animals to be worked and exploited and taxed and used up and abused and then thrown aside, and so I just wonder if that sort of mythos, the founding mythology and mythos of America, we hold these truths as self-evident, the enshrining of God-given rights into the founding documents. I wonder if that is what is kind of they're trying to get rid of through all this UN allegiance and overruling of the original American way of life by the new globalist, internationalist, supranational way of life pushed by the UN and UNESCO, which Ed Griffin very expertly described to us. The UN Charter had massive parallels and similarities with, I think, the Soviet, whatever that was, document, Soviet Declaration or something or other. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's hard to make sense of it otherwise, because it doesn't make any sense, right? Unless there's got to be something more to it than just, the UN just prefers communists. I don't know, though. That's just my spinning of what it means to me, So we'll have a quick review of the chat, then we'll get on with another chapter. Heidi says, tolerance is indifference. You do you is not kindness, it's indifference. That's a very good point, yeah. How about don't do you? How about you do a better version of you? And I'm going to tell you the ways in which I think you could improve, because I love you and I love you too much to let you stay the way you are. This is, I think, people might describe it as tough love. People nowadays will be like, oh, you can't tell him or her to buck up and be better and improve themselves. You got to love and accept everyone exactly the way they are. Well, you could. Or you could tell them, look, I see your potential and I believe in your potential. And I know that if you just apply yourself, if you just do 10% more effort and more work and go after something and dream big and push yourself out of your comfort zone and stop spending so much time on trivial behaviors and meaningless activities, I can see that you're capable of really great things and I want you to achieve that. And so I'm going to tell you, get off your ass and get out there and do something, you lazy prat. You don't have to word it in those ways, but what I'm kind of saying is I agree with you, Heidi, in that just saying, oh, you do you, you're fine as you are, whatever, it is indifference. Saying to somebody, you got so much potential and you're wasting, and it pains me in my heart to see you do that, that's more like love. That's more like kindness, and that's more sort of Christian, I would say, to hold someone to account and say, you got so much potential and I want to see you achieve it. Get after it. Come on. I know it's not easy, but what else are you going to do? Watch TV and eat popcorn. You know? So yeah, great comment, Heidi. Thank you. ESP over on Odyssey is saying, one thing I noticed about some ex-members of the club is free-thinking people, for example, Catherine Austin Fitz, bailed out early while compromised people are still hanging on. Right. Yeah, there's some people who were in there and then at some point they figured out, this is not what I thought it was. I need to get out of this now and start spreading the word. And Catherine Austin Fitz is a very good example. Some people will say, for example, as well, that, oh, anyone who's been in the military is controlled opposition and you can't trust anything they're saying. And that person used to be in the military and therefore I don't buy into that. You know, people make mistakes. People make decisions when they're young and then they learn and they wise up and they change later on in life. You know, I've seen accusations that Nigel Watson is controlled opposition. I'm like, maybe he is, but I don't see any signs of it. He looks to me like he was a economics teacher trying to do his best in the system here, paying his taxes, saving up, planning for the future. Then lockdowns happened and it changed everything. This is exactly what happened to me, you know. Just because somebody used to be in the military or used to be in the system in some way doesn't mean that they cannot now become critics of that system. You know, this is what whistleblowers are, and some of the people with the highest levels of integrity and ethical sense of duty and doing what's right, you know, are whistleblowers, because they have to turn their back on their whole way of life. They have to turn their back on money, career, riches. Maybe it upsets and ruins their marriage or their friendships or their relationships. Maybe they have to leave the country or downsize into a small house, or maybe their partner who didn't work previously now has to go back to work as some rudimentary minimum wage job just to make ends meet. Like the strength of character it takes to become a whistleblower and to turn your life around when you've devoted so much into a system is staggering. I think many of us can't even imagine doing that. Maybe many of us can. I don't know. I shouldn't speak for everybody. But yeah, great point, ESP. The compromised people are still hanging on, still believing in the system. Just vote harder. If we just get the right person in, they'll fix everything. All right, we got a little bit going on YouTube. I will try to catch up. And Fuego says, QWERTY people is another good one I've heard. I think you're referring to clownfish rainbow people. Shame Anarchist, good evening, says everything is shite nowadays. Cheerful, feeling good tonight, are we? Shame Anarchist says, what would the founding fathers think of that, I wonder? But just to go back to your point that everything is shite nowadays, I get where you're coming from, man. Or a woman, I don't know. I shouldn't assume your gender, or clownfish, you know, whatever you are. But things break more easily. Things are tacky. Things are not high quality. I think, you know, I always think you should be able to buy like one thing, buy it once, and it should last you the rest of your life. You know, you should be able to get a pair of shoes that just lasts, depending on how much trekking and walking, whatever. It should last a long time. You should be able to get one thing and it just lasts. One fridge, one washing machine, and that's it. There's no reason why you can't build things to do that, unless you deliberately want to make things rubbish and shoddy and break easy so you can sell more and more and more units, you know, and just keep turning over that profit, keep making money for the shareholders and the investors and the people who really own things around here, which is not you and I. So that's kind of, you know, I think things are being allowed to crumble in a very controlled way, like a controlled demolition. It's kind of like a controlled demolition of a building, but also a slow motion car crash rolled into one, what we're living through, I think. And it's sort of slowly accelerating as well. It's a bit weird. But yeah, a lot of things. I wouldn't say everything, but I'd say a lot of things are shy nowadays. And Fuego says, the word tolerate itself implies that someone is violating the non-aggression principle. That's interesting. I might have to think about that one a bit more. Yeah, the word tolerate suggests something unpleasant or unfair or putting up with something that you wouldn't otherwise. Just put up with it. Just don't say anything. Just tolerate it. What's the alternative to tolerating it? Doing something about it. So yeah, that takes us right onto Johnny's point next, which is they want people passive, put up or shut up policies, says Share Anarchist. Yeah. Onto the American Dream, Shamanicus says, everything the American dream of success through your own hard work and initiative has been undermined. Yeah, that's it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and put some hard work in and you'll make it. And I think there are many examples of people out there working extremely hard. You know, you got to have luck as well. You got to have intelligence. You got to have calculated risk taking and risk management. You got to have probably the backing of people who support you and love you and want to see you succeed. And maybe, you know, it's not just as simple as work hard and it'll work out, right? There's a lot more at play in what makes people successful and get to a good state. I'm not downplaying the importance of working hard. Working hard is very important, but working hard on its own doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get ahead and get, you know, the success that you're aiming for. And Fuego says, American here, it was true for a time. However, Hamilton was instrumental in starting to degrade what essentially was an anarcho-capitalist country to bring it back under the British model. And didn't they recently make some sort of musical about Hamilton? I haven't been to see it, but it's interesting that you mention Hamilton as being the one who degraded it and brought it back under the British model. And I'm also aware of I'm pretty sure there's a musical doing the rounds at the minute called Hamilton. Celine Lyon, I just saw your name. Teacher analogy is quite apt as they replace the liberal arts with the servile arts. Ooh, servile arts, that's a good phrase. I haven't heard that before. Celine Lyon says, the dumbing down of humanity as we live in brightly coloured dark ages. Well, that's a good one as well. You're in a very poetic mood tonight. Just on the topic of dumbing down, I'm very happy that I finally got a copy of this ridiculously huge book. Finally. This is The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, Charlotte Tomet Iserbyt. Chronological paper trail. What is it? What's the subtitle? Something like a chronological paper trail of how they've ruined education. This book, it's just a chronological paper trail. It's about 700 pages and it has massive amounts of appendix in the back. And I got a good deal with this because it's got like coffee stains on it. It's got some water damage. And I just jumped on it. I thought, yes, I got to get that. So that is one that I'm very excited about working through at some point. But as you can see, it's ridiculous. It's such a ridiculously sized book. To compare The Fearful Master to that, I'll probably need a bigger book cam and desk to read that one on stream. But that's a good one that I think people should be aware of and look into when it comes to, you know, dumbing people down, because there's a whole book there about it. Johnny Fogg is saying Nigel Watson's 100% the real deal, a straight up bloke. That's my sense and that's my impression. You know, not everyone can be up to date on absolutely every angle, on every topic, on every issue. Some people you got to draw the line somewhere. You can't be an expert in all things and know everything from every angle, right? So I think my sense, I've talked to him 3 times now, I think. I always got a good sense from him that he's doing what his conscience is telling him to do. That's as far as I can, you know, that's as much as I can say. And I think that's the best you can say about anyone. If you are following your conscience, trying to discover truth, speak the truth, and stick up for the truth, then you're on the right path. And it doesn't matter. We shouldn't judge each other for how far along, how much we do or don't know. Or he doesn't know the truth about this event and he's not speaking up. That means it's like it's a lifelong journey for all of us, and we should help each other along rather than like pull each other back for, you know, missing a certain point or nuance about a certain thing, right? Shamanica says Neil Oliver used to be a BBC guy. Since COVID, now look at him. Yeah, I like to call him Scottish Jesus. I'm not sure about Neil Oliver. I'm more sure about Nigel Watson than I am about Neil Oliver. I'm not sure about Neil Oliver at all. Although he does, his content is good and he comes up with really good rants and his accent's really soothing to listen to as well, for what it's worth. Immune to PR is here. Hello. Shamanicist is a transgender jellyfish. Good to know. I thought it'd be something like that. Yeah, the homogeneity of this era. Okay. Cool. I think we're up to date. So I think we can dive back into the book and do another chapter. Good little comment session there. Thank you for leaving those comments and having a bit of interaction. That's really good fun. I appreciate it when people are vocal and have stuff to say. But yeah, this is, to me, I'm kind of feeling like what Griffin's describing here is just the kind of the game. I don't know what, there's a book called A Game of Nations. I feel like these very high level planners, long-term planners, you know, the real controllers who have these schemes that go way back, I think they do look at countries as, or the world, let's say, as a kind of chessboard, and they move pieces around and they'll block pieces progress, you know, like in Korea. I didn't know too much about the Korean War, but it sounds like America was really prevented from doing what it could do, what it was capable of doing. When I did live in South Korea, I thought it was really odd that nobody had ever gone into North Korea to sort it out and rescue the people there. You know, and we're told in the West, we kind of not so much nowadays, but we stand up for democracy and we spread democracy around the world, and we will fight tyrants and people like Saddam Hussein is trying to gas his own population. We're going to go in and save those people. And I was like, why aren't you saving North Koreans then? You've got this stronghold in the South where people are sympathetic. You've got the North Koreans risking their life trying to escape, get over the border into the South, and you're not going to go in there and rescue all these people? No, we'll just leave them there. And so it's like the only lens through which that makes sense is if there's other forces, and it's a kind of game of moving pieces around and manipulating the narrative and keeping a tight control on what happens and what doesn't happen. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of the way it sounds to me, because I just don't think there's any other way to really make sense of these things. Okay, let's get back on with another chapter. Oh, Empuego says the grand chessboard. I'll just, for the benefit of people, point out that is a Zbigniew Brzezinski book, not Kissinger. But yes, the grand chessboard. I haven't read it yet, but I have it on my shelf over there. All about perpetual and unwinnable wars. Ooh, that sounds like a good one then. We should read that. So many books and so little time. That's all good. You got the title of the book right, and that's the important thing. Anybody who typed in the grand chessboard would have found it. So I don't know if Kissinger wrote books, did he? I don't have any books by Kissinger, and I've never, to my knowledge, heard of one and thought, ooh, I got to get hold of that and read it. So I don't know if Kissinger put books out there. I have a couple of books about him, though. But I don't know if he actually did write books. Anyway, chapter 15, The Silken Thread. And we have a couple of quotes here to kick this off. First is Patrick Henry. Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the elusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? It's from 1775. And Thomas Jefferson. We have only to awake and snap the Lilliputian cords with which they have been entangling us during the first sleep which succeeded our labours. And that was 1796, so pretty good quotes there, and quite good timing, just as we were discussing Founding Fathers and the origins of America. All right. In the story, Gulliver's Travels, we all recall the way in which the tiny Lilliputians succeeded in rendering Gulliver powerless until they were sure he could be trusted. When they found him unconscious after being washed up on the beach, they immediately set out to bind him down with what to them was heavy rope, but was to Gulliver only the finest of silken thread. The Lilliputians worked frantically through the night, knowing that they had to finish their job before the morning sun rose to awaken the giant from his slumber. When Gulliver finally came to, he found himself entirely helpless and unable to move even a finger. The thread, which he could have easily broken at any one place, had been carefully wrapped around his body thousands of times and was more than his match. For the past 2 decades, the United States, the giant among all the world powers, has been lying semi-conscious, while lesser forces bind him hand and foot with thousands of strands of silken thread. Throughout these years, he has, bit by bit, allowed himself to become entangled in every conceivable kind of agreement, commitment, and treaty, any one of which would not be disastrous by itself, but the sum of which is rapidly adding up to total capture. At the present time, there are 113 member states in the United Nations, and just as a side note, we read on, I think, the first video that there's almost 109, I think there's 193 now, or 192. Over 50% of these have a combined population of less than the United States. Many, like Iceland with a population of 200,000, would be hard-pressed to rate even as one of our congressional districts. There are 56 members whose population is less than that of metropolitan Detroit. It is possible to get a majority in the General Assembly from nations that between themselves contribute less than 7% of the annual budget. And most of even that 7% was first given to them as foreign aid by the United States. When the Charter was submitted to the Senate for ratification in 1945, there were only 2 portions which received much publicity. The opening sentence of the preamble, which proclaimed, "to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," and the 7th paragraph of Article 2, which states, "Nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit to such settlement under the present Charter." It is extremely doubtful that the Charter would have been ratified had it not been for this latter guarantee that other nations could not use the United Nations to meddle in our private affairs. But as Americans were later to find out, there is nothing that the UN considers to be essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of America. This became obvious around 1949. Mr. Levi Carnero, writing that year in the UNESCO Symposium on Human Rights, stated, quote, "Relations between states are based on the assumption that the internal policies of each nation are the concern of all nations." What? Let me read that again. Relations between states are based on the assumption that the internal policies of each nation are the concern of all nations. Okay. Mr. Moses Moskowitz, a noted internationalist, made the following statement in the American Bar Association Journal in April of the same year. "Once a matter has become, in one way or another, the subject of regulation by the UN, be it by resolution of the General Assembly or by convention between member states at the instance of the UN, that subject ceases to be a matter of being essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the member states." By the following year, 1950, our State Department under Dean Acheson was saying the same thing. In September, it issued a formal policy statement with a foreword by President Truman which read, quote, "There is now no longer any real difference between domestic and foreign affairs." And on May the 22nd, 1959, while speaking before the students at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, President Eisenhower said, "For us indeed there are no longer foreign affairs and foreign policy. Since such affairs belong to and affect the entire world, they are essentially local affairs for every nation, including our own." A clear example of what far-reaching implications are carried with this philosophy was provided on August the 7th, 1963, when the Security Council voted 9-0 in favor of a resolution taking action against South Africa for its policy of racial segregation. Regardless of how we may feel about racial segregation in South Africa, it is definitely the internal or domestic affair of that country. Nevertheless, the United Nations took it upon itself to impose an arms embargo and other sanctions under the justification that racial segregation in South Africa was somehow seriously disturbing international peace and security. The attitude of the UN was expressed during the debates by Carlos Alfredo Bernardes of Brazil, who said that the question now was whether to continue to rely on persuasion or to advocate more energetic and coercive methods of action. Nikolai Fedorenko of the Soviet Union piously described the situation in South Africa as a reign of terror and violence maintained by fascists' methods. Aside from the fact that South Africa is one of the few remaining prosperous and strongly anti-communist countries in Africa, there are several interesting points about this UN resolution. One is the clear and unmistakable violation of the Charter, as we have already mentioned. Another is the slavish way in which the US almost always follows the Soviet lead in such matters. When this question came before the UN on a previous occasion, US Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge rose and said, quote, "An item of this character invites questions about the competence of the General Assembly under Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the Charter. The US has observed, with increasing concern, the tendency of the General Assembly to place on its agenda subjects the international character of which is doubtful." After saying this, Lodge then turned around and voted in favour of the resolution. That was on September the 16th, 1953. 10 years later, on August the 7th, 1963, US Ambassador Stevenson was carrying on the Lodge tradition by voting with the Soviets against South Africa. Since it has been clearly established that America's domestic affairs are all now international in character and, as such, are subject to United Nations jurisdiction, consider what might happen in the not-too-distant future if the Soviet Union should charge the US with political discrimination because of its laws to limit the activities of the Communist Party in this country. What would the United Nations World Court decide? Under the terms of the Charter, we have pledged ourselves to promote full employment and social and economic progress for all peoples. If we decided to stop our foreign aid to India or Communist Poland, and these countries charged that we were not living up to our Charter obligations, what would the World Court decide? If Fidel Castro charged the United States with threatening international peace and security by keeping its naval base at Guantanamo, what would the World Court decide? There are 15 justices on the World Court. Article 25 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice says that 9 judges constitute a quorum for the court to do business, and a majority of the 9 can render judgments. This means that 5 judges can determine decisions. The statute also states the court may, from time to time, form 1 or more chambers composed of 3 or more judges, as the court may determine, for dealing with particular categories of cases, for example, labour cases and cases relating to transit and communications. In other words, in some matters, decisions can be rendered by as few as 2 justices. Of the 15 justices on the United Nations World Court, most come from strongly leftist or communist countries. The United States is represented on this court by Philip Jessup, whose background with Alger Hiss and the Institute of Pacific Relations has already been discussed. What would the court decide? When the United States joined the United Nations, it automatically became a member of the World Court, but it was not bound by the court's jurisdiction unless and until it filed a formal declaration in the form of a Senate-ratified treaty. Senator Wayne Morse introduced in the Senate a resolution, quote, recognizing as compulsory the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in all legal disputes hereafter arising, provided that such declaration shall not apply to disputes with regard to matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States. Suspecting that there might be a little difficulty in the future definition of matters, quote, essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States, some of the senators began to look more cautiously at the whole resolution. Senator Thomas Connally was eager for the US to at least go on record as accepting some jurisdiction of the World Court. Rather than see the whole issue defeated, he proposed a simple amendment to the Morse resolution. It consisted of 6 words, as determined by the United States. With this amendment, the resolution passed by a vote of 62-2 on the 2nd of August 1946. As of today, these 6 words are all that stand between us and complete legal subjection to the whims of 15 or 9 or 5 or even 2 men whose legal backgrounds and personal ideologies may be strongly antipathetic to the free world in general and to the United States in particular. In spite of this, there has been a concerted drive in this country to generate support for the repeal of the Connally Amendment. The basic stratagem behind this drive has been to trick Americans into believing that unless we repeal the amendment, we are self-judging our own case. This is then supposed to shame us into being big enough and courageous enough to openly submit our cases to impartial judgment. This, of course, is an invalid argument, since all we are doing is challenging the jurisdiction of the court. Right, hang on. We're in the crease again with this page. This, of course, is an invalid argument, since all we are doing is challenging the jurisdiction of the court to try these cases in the first place. This is a common and ancient practice in American law. Just as we would refuse to submit a murder case to a traffic court, we have a right to refuse to submit a case involving domestic affairs to an international court. In view of the prevailing accepted definition of domestic affairs, this reservation is more important than ever before. Nevertheless, the drive to repeal the Connally Amendment has been carried forward relentlessly by United Nations devotees under the appealing and attractive banner of world peace through world law. Not only has the Communist Party pushed hard for repeal, for repeal. But unfortunately, so have Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy, Stevenson, Rusk, and Johnson. Accepting compulsory jurisdiction of the United Nations World Court is just one of the threads that is rapidly binding Uncle Sam into complete helplessness. It is, however, one of the most important because many of the others could be untied in time without it. Should this one be secured, though, poor Gulliver will not have a chance. The silken thread to which we have been referring actually takes the form of international treaties. As John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, said in 1952, the treaty-making power is an extraordinary power liable to abuse. Treaties make international law, and also they make domestic law. Under our Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land. They are indeed more supreme than ordinary laws, for congressional laws are invalid if they do not conform to the Constitution, whereas treaty laws can override the Constitution. Treaties, for example, can take powers away from the Congress and give them to the federal government or to some international body, and they can cut across the rights given the people by the Constitutional Bill of Rights. That was John Foster Dulles. This may come as a shock to those who have harbored the idea that they are protected as American citizens by the Bill of Rights. But as a result of a series of Supreme Court decisions, it is now entirely possible for us to enter into a treaty with a foreign government or the United Nations, which would, as Mr. Dulles said, cut across the rights given the people by the Constitutional Bill of Rights. If the UN Covenant on Human Rights, for instance, should ever receive the support of 2/3 of our senators, whether they realized what they were doing or not, our whole Bill of Rights would be automatically and immediately repealed. It is that simple. Of course, our founding fathers who drafted our constitutional system never intended for it to be this way. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "By the general power to make treaties, the Constitution must have intended to comprehend only those objects which are usually regulated by treaties, and cannot be otherwise regulated. It must have meant to accept out all those rights reserved to the states, For surely the President and the Senate cannot do by treaty what the whole government is interdicted from doing in any way. This is the view that prevailed for many years in America. In 1936, in its decision in the case of New Orleans versus the U.S., the Supreme Court pointed out, quote, "The government of the United States is one of limited powers. It can exercise authority over no subjects except those that have been delegated to it. Congress cannot, by legislation, enlarge the federal jurisdiction, nor can it be enlarged under the treaty-making power." This concept of limited government is the whole basis of the American system. By taking the chains off the people and placing them on the government, we establish the formula for freedom and enterprise which has made us the envy of the world. While other nations were still labouring under a system where government officials are free to do anything they claim is in the best interests of all, American leaders had first to consult a meaningful constitution to make sure that their proposals, in addition to being good, were also constitutional. And if not, what then? George Washington answered that when he said, quote, "If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for, though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed." But that was a long time ago. Today, our politicians tell us that those concepts are out of date and antiquated, that these modern times demand fresh approaches and greater flexibility in order to cope with the challenge of the atomic age. Only those who have never studied the demagoguery of past ages could accept these as fresh approaches. They may sound new, but they are the same worn arguments used to sell dictatorship to the people from ancient Rome to Nazi Germany. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Special Assistant to President Kennedy, said in a speech delivered on February the 15th, 1962, quote, "Jefferson is today remote and irrelevant, a figure not of present concern, but of historical curiosity." On August the 28th, 1961, President Kennedy spoke to a gathering of students at the White House and said, quote, "After all, the Constitution was written under entirely different conditions. It was written during a period of isolation. It was written at a time when there were 13 different units which had to be joined together and which, of course, were extremely desirous of limiting the central power of the government. That Constitution has served us extremely well, but it has to be made to work today in an entirely different world from the day in which it was written." That same year, Senator J. William Fulbright, one of the country's most outspoken internationalists, made a speech at Stanford University. Fulbright was less guarded in his choice of words than President Kennedy, but expressed the same views when he said, quote, "The President is hobbled in his task of leading the American people to consensus and concerted action by the restrictions of power imposed upon him by a constitutional system designed for an 18th century agrarian society far removed from the centers of world power. It is imperative that we break out of the intellectual confines of cherished and traditional beliefs and open our minds to the possibility that basic changes in our system may be essential to meet the requirements of the 20th century. He, the President, alone among elected officials can rise above parochialism and private pressures. He alone, in his role as teacher and moral leader, can hope to overcome the excesses and inadequacies of public opinion." Still at it in 1963, Senator Fulbright stated, "Government by the people is possible but highly improbable. The case of governments by elites is irrefutable insofar as it rests on the need for expert and specialized knowledge." Since the Ten Commandments also date back to an agrarian society, and since they were established not 200 but 3,000 years ago, it would be interesting to have the Senator's views on the extent to which we must, quote, "break out of the intellectual confines of these cherished and traditional beliefs to meet the requirements of the 20th century." But Fulbright did not give us the benefit of his wisdom on this subject, nor did he say just when this nation under God became dependent upon its leading politicians for moral guidance, or when it was transformed from a government of the people to a government of the elite. It was the year 1920 that marked the beginning of a long chain of events leading up to this present repudiation of our traditional American concept of limited government. It was in that year that the Supreme Court in Missouri v. Holland reversed its previous position and declared that a federal law, which was otherwise unconstitutional, must be considered valid if it is in accordance with a treaty. In one fell swoop, 9 men completely undermined our Bill of Rights and all other constitutional safeguards that have been so painstakingly erected by our founding fathers. While many years were to pass before the full impact of this sweeping decision was to be felt in our everyday lives, still the brakes had been released and the massive machinery of totalitarianism began to inch forward. The totalitarian tiptoe. By 1942, it had gained considerable momentum, so much so in fact that the concept of supremacy was extended to include not only treaties, which must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, but also executive orders, personal agreements, and international compacts entered into by the President, which do not have to be ratified nor even seen by the Senate or anybody else. In U.S. v. Pink, the Supreme Court ruled, "A treaty is the law of the land. Such international compacts and agreements as the Litvinov Assignment have similar dignity. State law must yield when it is inconsistent with or impairs the policy or provisions of a treaty, or of an international compact or agreement." What this means is that America has now reached the point where it is legally possible for the president to issue orders to enforce some agreement which he himself has made with another government or with the United Nations, and these orders are absolute and final with no recourse to constitutional safeguards. Recent presidents have not yet dared to exercise more than a small fraction of that power, knowing that, legal or not, they would have trouble enforcing such edicts. Nevertheless, the lever of raw dictatorship is fully operable any time the chief executive wishes to throw it. That is crazy. That is absolutely scary. President Truman tugged at it gently when he committed us to war in Korea. Remember when only Congress could declare war and send American boys to battle? Truman simply changed the name from war to police action and issued a decree. He was acting on the authority placed in him, not by the United States government, but by the United Nations Charter. He pushed at the lever again when he decided to seize some steel mills with uniformed soldiers. How many Americans stopped to wonder where the president got the power to do a thing like that? And how many felt any cause for alarm when he said that he was acting to uphold our commitment to the United Nations and NATO? On February the 23rd, 1954, Indiana's Senator William Jenner revealed that the machinery had gained even greater forward momentum when he declared, quote, "The doctrine that the president could make personal agreements was extended to the doctrine that agreements made by any authorized member of the government bureaucracy in the name of the president had the same effect as those made by the president. Mr. Dulles tells us that 10,000 executive agreements have been made pursuant to NATO alone. The United Nations is preparing a series of treaties which operate as domestic legislation, affecting our citizens in matters on which our Constitution does not permit even the federal government to legislate. They would abolish our Bill of Rights and replace it with a body of state-granted privileges and duties modeled exactly upon the Soviet Constitution." At the conclusion of his speech, Senator Jenner urged his colleagues to support the Bricker Amendment, which was then under discussion in both houses of Congress. The Bricker Amendment was a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which simply stated that the Bill of Rights and other constitutional provisions were under no circumstances to be overridden by any treaty. It was so simple, so logical, and so desirable that there seemed no good reason why the proposal should not receive the enthusiastic support of everyone. The 1952 Republican platform contained a promise to support the Bricker Amendment, and, surprisingly enough, even Eisenhower went along with no objections. Then, of course, he was a candidate. After the elections, Eisenhower made a complete about-face and used the full prestige of his office to oppose the Bricker Amendment. He, more than any other man, was responsible for its ultimate defeat. As Marquis Childs reported in the Washington Post, quote, "Once the president decided to come down firmly and unequivocally against the Bricker Amendment, the outcome of the contest was never in doubt. For 2/3 of the Senate to vote against the president on such a crucial issue would have been, for all practical purposes, the end of the Eisenhower administration." Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the man who had so brilliantly explained how treaties can cut across our Bill of Rights, was now speaking against the Bricker Amendment on behalf of the Eisenhower administration. He spoke before the Senate Judiciary Committee on April 6, 1953, and assured those present that the new administration had no intention of doing any of the dangerous things he had previously said could be done through treaty law. So a bit of an about-face there. In other words, under a government of such good men as Eisenhower and Dulles, who needs laws? When the test finally came in the Senate, the Bricker Amendment failed to pass by just one vote. It is now doubly interesting to return to the pages of the April 1945 issue of the communist periodical Political Affairs and read the ominous prediction. Quote, "After the charter is passed at San Francisco, it will have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and this action will establish a weighty precedent for other treaties and agreements still to come." Interesting. That is the end of chapter 15. And what do you all think of that? If anything. Heidi had a really good quote about, I'll see if I can find it very quickly. It was in the Telegram group. By the way, just a quick shout out, if you want to follow me and what I'm up to, you can join the Telegram, Instagram, or Twitter Haze Reviews pages. Just search for Haze Reviews and you will find it. Heidi had a really good quote about legal... What was it? I'm gonna mess it up, so rescue me, Heidi, if you're listening to this and you're in the chat on Rumble. It was something to do with how God is not legalistic, but demons are. Something like that. Let me see if I can find it, because it was quite a good one. God isn't a legalist, but the demons are. That's it. I almost got it. I pretty much got it right. And I just like this idea that all this legalistic wordplay, all this legalistic wordplay, interpretation of words to catch people out and to entrap and ensnare people is a very demonic thing, right? We were having a chat in the Cutting Through the Matrix book club group, and somebody talked about liability. And I said, oh, you mean liability, as in the ability to lie, right? Words are so fascinating in these multiple layers of meaning that they have. And the legalistic system, some people will probably know, is based on, it's very closely linked to like sailing and maritime law. A lot of the words are used, overlap with sailing terminology. And it's a tricky, hard to navigate realm is the language that's used by solicitors and lawyers and used in court, and the language of treaties and the language of laws versus, the agreements and the Constitution. Because when you boil it all down, it's all just documents written by men, just human beings writing stuff down, and women, human beings writing stuff down, and therefore does it have any pull? Does it have any authority really, other than what you'd believe it has? You can get a letter through your door and it's big red letters and scary looking and says, you owe us this money now. And if you don't give us this money, you're going to owe us even more money. And people feel very threatened by a letter that's printed in red and tells them to give us some money now. And people will go and pay it and give the money, when there might be absolutely no legal resource or obligation whatsoever on your side to hand that money over. But you are just sort of misled into thinking you have to pay it, right? This is what I was talking about earlier about they'll put an offer on the table and they'll lie to you and try and get you to accept that offer, but ultimately it comes down to you accepting that offer, right? That whole chapter there about these legalistic ties to bind the American giant, that image of Gulliver being tied up by the Lilliputians was a really powerful one, because when you think about how convoluted the bureaucracies we live within have become and how nonsensical all the rules are, and we're kind of at that Kafkaesque point now where even if you followed everything to the letter, nothing would ever get done and you would end up breaking some rule somewhere at some point, because there's no way it is all coherent and makes sense and can be obeyed 100% of the time by everybody. Instead, it's become so unwieldy, kind of like that lever of power that the president of the United States has, which hasn't been fully pressed yet, but it's there waiting to be used, right? It's like that. It's like all these traps and snares and tripwires have been laid out, and you can fall into one or activate one and it might not go off. But the fact is that they're all laid out there waiting, ready to ensnare you whenever the system decides to switch them on to start trapping people, if that makes sense. That's what it feels like to me. It's kind of like this minefield, but it's like speeding cameras, the yellow ones we have in England, these big boxes, and you never know if there's a camera in one or not, because they only have limited number of cameras, so they take them out and they put them in different ones at different times. So it's like the panopticon. You don't know if you're being watched, so you act as though you are being watched all the time. It's a really powerful way to control people, to get people to fall in line and obey. We saw a lot of this back during the Big C event 2020. People so terrified of being seen to step out of line or break a rule or do something that was considered bad or dangerous or against the law or against the directive, or people get very paranoid and stressed and worried about following all the rules. And I think they're designed to be impossible to follow, and they're designed to get people scared and on the back foot and worried about breaking them, so that you try hard to obey them. And I think setting that up on an international level so that it undercuts the rules and the documents and the founding documents of a nation is a really sinister, evil thing to do, because who's to say that whatever the United Nations wants you to go and get involved in is more important, more vital, more urgent than your home, your national situations that you're dealing with. And I think this is largely why they're blending all the world's populations together, and they're opening the doors and bringing loads of people in and forcing them to mix when they might not want to, and not giving people an option or a say or a voice. And if you do call it out and say you don't like it, then you get in prison sentences. Over 1,000 people arrested in this country now for saying the wrong thing, having the wrong opinion about an issue which is very close to their heart and is affecting their lives and every single day. I think part of the blending together of populations in this way is to erode that sense of loyalty and patriotism and loyalty to your nation and your culture and your country. Wear that down, break that down, and replace it with a loyalty to the one world system, the supranational system. And maybe it's not a one world system. Maybe it's like a 1984 type system where you have three power centers, Eurasia and East Asia, or whatever they are, whatever they're called in that book. I can't remember now. And they're constantly at war, but the war is just a fake thing to keep. It's just an illusion that they tell you is ongoing and never ending, because that's how they maintain control, and that's how they maintain taxation and fear, by telling you we're at war, so we have to do this, and you can't have, we have to ration everything, and we have to control everything, and tell it, because like Alan Watt always says, you can push through more societal change during a time of war than you can at a time of peace, because people just accept it. We're at war, we have to buckle down for the greater good. So it's strange, very strange times. This interplay of internationalism against nationalism, of country versus larger, like UN versus EU versus BRICS. It's a very complex, convoluted, strange time to be alive. I'm not very good at explaining it, as you probably just noticed. But Griffin's account of how the legal system is totally hijacked and taken over, and it's not going to protect you, and it's not on your side. My advice would be to have as little to do with the legal system as you possibly can. Really just stay far, far, far away from it, because in the end, we're getting to that point now where it's going to be about money. It's going to be about paying off the right people. And if you have more money, you can afford the best word salad people who can make the best arguments using the nuance of the words and in different interpretations of the codes and the rules and how they're written down. And if you got the right money and you can pay the people who are best at doing that, then you'll be all right. You're not going to get in trouble. But the system, that whole system, they call it, I was trying to think of an example, because they call it the criminal justice system, right? And it's such a weird phrase to call something. If and I was trying to think of another example where we use that, because you can read it that it's the system that provides justice for criminals, the criminal justice system, right? And I was trying to think of a similar example. And I was trying to use the word children, and I was thinking like children play area, but you say children's with an apostrophe S, like it belongs to the children's play area, or children's clothes, right? But the clothes that belong to the children. So I couldn't quite think of a good analog, but criminal justice system it does suggest that it's justice for criminals, or the justice belongs to the criminals. Right there in the name, in the title of what they call it. So the system isn't there to benefit the little man, the Joe and Jane on the street, to protect us from criminals. It's there to protect the criminals from us, I think. And quite an incredible chapter to read about how that system on the level of the US was subverted, how that lever of power has been planted in for the president to pull, some future president to pull on, to use, to wield, to totally bypass the sovereignty of the nation, basically. So very sneaky, creepy, underhand tactics that are being used. So I'm just going to check actually how we're doing for time. We've got quite a bit of time. 2 hours 14 we've been going. How many pages we got left? Should we do another bit now, or shall we save all this for the final video? So we're on page 196, and the book ends on page 236, which means there's 40 pages left exactly. 40 pages left exactly. It might be good to do all that in the last. Do that all at once. The next chapter is 10 pages. Yeah. I think maybe we'll do 10 pages now, and we'll save 30 for the final video. It's only 10 pages, an easy one. Shame Anarchist says, yeah, justice for criminals. That's what it sounds like. The criminal justice system, it means the justice system for criminals. Very Orwellian doublespeak, yeah. Frank Lennon, page 189, interesting stuff. about treaties from Dulles, thinking about the WHO so-called pandemonic treaty. Yeah, what happened to that? Did that get enforced? I didn't pay attention. I'm sort of more into reading books and not keeping up with the current thing these days, and so I'm a bit behind. I'm not on the bleeding edge of what's going on in the world because it's tiring, and it's like a full-time job just to keep up with that. And because I don't really deal with news and current events so much explicitly on this show, I tend not to keep up with them. Although I do check in on Newsfist and Grand Theft World. Oh, I'm muted. Box off the final bit next time, question mark, says Shermanicist. I think we'll do the 10 pages now. And then on the next video, we'll have 30 pages to get through. And we can have a little wrap-up summary discussion. What is it about this bit? The dangerous servant. Okay, chapter 16 is the dangerous servant. Chapter 17 is point of no return. Chapter 18 is our last best hope. So we'll do this 10 pages now, and then we'll do the last 30 pages on Saturday. The dangerous servant. We got a quote again, the same one that opens the book, from George Washington, which might be one of my new favorite quotes. I hadn't heard this one before. Government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. That's George Washington. Chapter 16, the dangerous servant. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The way to have good and safe government is not to trust it all to one, but to divide it among the many, distributing to everyone exactly the functions he is competent to handle. Let the national government be entrusted with the defense of the nation and its foreign and federal relations, the state governments with the civil rights, laws, police, and administration of what concerns the state generally, the counties with the local concerns of the counties, and each ward direct the interests within itself. It is by dividing and subdividing these republics, from the great national one down through all its subordinations, that all will be done for the best. What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body, no matter whether the autocrats of Russia or France or of the aristocrats of a Venetian Senate. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the forms of kings to govern him? Let history answer the question." Indeed, history has answered the question. Not only the distant history to which Jefferson is here referring, but more recent events as well. In the 2 decades that followed the birth of this nation, men and women by the hundreds of thousands migrated here from all over the world because they knew that here was the land of freedom and opportunity, where a man could make his own deal with life without being bowed by the oppressive yoke of government directing his daily life. Carl Schurz was one such immigrant, and his words written in 1853 serve as monumental tribute to the wisdom of such men as Washington and Jefferson. Quote, "Here in America, you can see daily how little a people needs to be governed. There are governments, but no masters. There are governors, but they are only commissioners, agents. What there is here of great institutions of learning, of churches, of great commercial institutions, lines of communication, etc., almost always owes its existence not to official authority, but to the spontaneous cooperation of private citizens. Here you witness the productiveness of freedom. We learn here how superfluous is the action of governments concerning a multitude of things in which in Europe it is deemed absolutely indispensable, and how the freedom to do something awakens the desire to do it. All of this, of course, was no mere accident. As we have seen, the men who drafted our Constitution and set the infant nation on its way knew full well what they were doing. They were brilliant scholars of history who had closely studied the factors that led previous nations into misery and slavery. They were determined to spare us the same fate. So, when they drafted the Constitution, they inserted, among other things, Article 4, Section 4, which states, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a republican form of government." This means a limited form of government. They knew that the Union would not last if the individual states of the federal government itself were allowed to become despotic and unrestrained. The Constitution further stipulated, "The enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." Compare this with the ideological foundation upon which the United Nations is built. Instead of ensuring that all member states have limited forms of government, the UN assumes that they have unlimited power over their subjects. The UN is not concerned about the fact that a majority of its members are governments which rule the police state with police-state methods. Instead of assuming that any power not specifically mentioned in the Constitution is reserved to the individual citizens or their smaller governmental units, the United Nations assumes that the Charter is vague and broad enough so as to authorize it to do absolutely everything. This concept of unlimited power was made unmistakably clear when the UN World Court declared, quote, "Under international law, the organization, UN, must be deemed to have those powers which, though not expressly provided in the Charter, are conferred upon it by necessary implication as being essential to the performance of its duties." As a result, the United Nations has become a professional politician's paradise. It is a world forum, world court, World Department of Education, World Welfare Agency, World Planning Center for Industry and Commerce, World Financial Agency, World Police Force, and anything else anyone might want or might not want. The bedrock for world socialism, upon which the United Nations is built, can be found in Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter. Article 56 states, "All members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. And the purposes set forth in Article 55 are as follows. Quote, "The United Nations shall promote A. higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. B. Solutions of international, economic, social, health and related problems, and international culture and educational cooperation." Since the United States is pledged to promote, among other things, the health of the world's populations, it would be well to take a look at the UN definition of health. The Constitution of the United Nations World Health Organization states, quote, "Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Governments have a responsibility for the health of their peoples which can be fulfilled only by the provisions of adequate health and social measures." Olga Hiss, one of the original guiding lights of the UN World Health Organization, expanded the concept even further when he said, quote, "It includes not only the more conventional fields of activity, but also mental health, housing, nutrition, economic or working conditions, and administrative and social techniques affecting public health." This simply means that the United States is bound by treaty to uphold its pledge to promote unlimited government meddling around the world, to promote the very thing against which it fought a revolution 200 years earlier. Advocates of this old world concept of unlimited government quite naturally do not call it old world. They like to think that they have discovered something new. Nor do they call it meddling. They prefer to think of it as providing assistance. Certainly, they would not want it called socialism. National programming is the term. Call it what you will, the end result is still the same. But of course, this is a study of the UN, not a treatise on the relative merits of collectivism versus individualism, except as this subject is unavoidably implicated in what we have dealt with so far. Let us simply summarize the whole issue by saying that socialism and all other manifestations of collectivism, such as fascism, communism, etc., would be just fine except for two considerations. First, they've never worked. As the saying goes, socialism will work in only two places, heaven, where they don't need it, and hell, where they already have it. And secondly, they are immoral. History has proved the first point beyond all doubt, and logic substantiates the second. That's a really good page quote. I like that bit that he just said. I'm just going to tab that quickly. Interesting that he included fascism as a collectivist model. I hadn't thought about that before. But I think collectivism is the important word, is the important ism. Because a lot of people get caught up in the isms, socialism and capitalism and communism and fascism. Really, it's just collectivism. It's government top-down technocratic control for the greater good, right? Just using the police-backed power of government to force people to perform acts that would be charitable, if voluntarily performed, is like the Good Samaritan using a club to intimidate others into helping the poor traveller who had been beaten and robbed. At the point where he threatens to use force to accomplish what is in his mind a noble cause, he then becomes no better than the original attacker who, for the sake of argument, might have committed the robbery to secure money for what he considered to be a noble cause. This is just a refined version of saying that the ends justify the means. And if we accept that thesis, there is no end to the legalized plunder that will be our lot. Not all of the collectivists at the UN are promoting their schemes out of ignorance or innocence. Being indifferent to the moral implications, they also know full well that their proposals are not leading to the kind of workers' utopia that they keep predicting. They know that free enterprise is far more workable and productive than socialism, but they work tirelessly to promote socialism just the same, knowing that all collectivist systems must have planners and rulers, the elite to run the lives of the rest of us. They hope to be in line for the top jobs. Consider the following remarks made by Edward H. Carr, writing in the UNESCO Symposium on Human Rights. Quote, "If the new Declaration of the Rights of Man is to include provisions for social services, for maintenance in childhood, in old age, in inadequacy or in unemployment, it becomes clear that no society can guarantee the enjoyment of such rights unless it, in turn, has the right to call upon and direct the productive capacities of the individuals enjoying them." Someone always has to pay for these schemes, of course, and in the United Nations, Uncle Sam is elected. In 1953, the General Assembly voted to create a special UN fund for world economic development. A few years later, when it was learned that this fund would need $5 billion and that Americans would be paying approximately 70% of the total, Mr. Hans Singer, an Englishman, casually remarked, quote, "It will be a heavy burden on American taxpayers, but you will just have to manage that. You'll get accustomed to paying the taxes." Brock Chisholm, Director General of the United Nations World Health Organization, during a speech in 1957 further revealed the prevailing attitude among UN socialists when he said that it was manifestly absurd for a very small proportion of the human race, he's referring to the US of course, to enjoy a tremendous proportion of the world's natural resources. He said that this is not a sensible arrangement and must not last. Apparently the socialists in our own government agree with this thought, for on February 17, 1961, the State Department delivered the following official memorandum to the West German government. Quote, "We must design formulae which make allowances, as we do in our domestic taxation systems, for the principle that the richer among us shall bear a higher relative burden than the poor. In addition, we must come to recognize a principle on which the US has acted in the years after the Second World War. That principle is that a sustained accumulation of gold and other international reserves by any one country is disruptive to any international community, especially now when trade is expanding faster than gold production. We must learn to use our reserves on a communal basis. On September the 20th, 1963, international socialists listened with delight as President Kennedy addressed the opening session of the United Nations. Quote, "More than 4/5 of the entire UN system can be found today mobilizing the weapons of science and technology for the United Nations decade of development. But more, much more can be done. For example, a World Center for Health Communications under the World Health Organization could warn of epidemics and of the adverse effects of certain drugs, as well as transmit the results of new experiments and discoveries. Regional research centers could advance our common medical knowledge and train new scientists and doctors for new nations. A worldwide program of conservation could protect the forest and world game preserves now in danger of extinction, improve the marine harvest of food from our oceans, and prevent the contamination of our air and our water by industrial as well as nuclear pollution. And finally, a worldwide program of farm distribution, similar to our own nation's Food for Peace program, could give every hungry child the food he needs." At the conclusion of a previous speech by President Kennedy expressing similar views in relation to NATO, Mr. Paul Henry Spaak, leader of the Belgian Socialist Party, exclaimed, "This is perfect. I have found a successor." It should be obvious to any careful observer that there is no longer even the slightest challenge to socialist doctrine within the United Nations from any member state nations, including our own. Any wishful thinking we might have entertained to the contrary was certainly eradicated by Secretary General U Thant. Speaking on April the 5th, 1963 at Columbia University, he said, quote, "Not so long ago, there were quite divergent views in the membership of the UN about the desirability and wisdom for governments to set targets and adopt national plans or programs. Today, there is a broad measure of agreement about the usefulness of projections, planning, and programming as practical tools for economic and social development. While the controversy about the relative merits of private enterprise and public undertakings is transcended by the realization that the most important aim of development is to bring about expansion and change for the benefit of all." Translated into simple, understandable English, Tant said that everyone in the UN agrees that socialism is more practical and desirable than free enterprise. The socialistic bias of the UN is clearly revealed on nearly every page of the monthly United Nations Review. One can find reports on UN proceedings dealing with setting prices, production quotas, inventories, stockpiles of raw materials, labour standards, wages, and monetary policies. Every conceivable sphere of human economic activity is being analysed and then planned for so that it will come under the ultimate control of the United Nations. As the months slip by and as we enter into thousands of additional treaties, executive orders, and international agreements, the silken thread continues to be spun around the sleeping giant. The job is so near completion that already there are a multitude of United Nations regulations that reach right down to the daily lives of American citizens. An example is the International Wheat Conference, which actually decrees how much wheat our farmers may sell in foreign countries and sets the price to be paid for it. The federal government enforces these decrees by the authority derived from an international treaty. The International Materials Conference is another example. Set up in 1951, its purpose was to clamp down import and export quotas for certain strategic materials such as sulfur, copper, zinc, and tungsten. During the Korean War, we found that these quotas severely hampered the production of critical war materials and resulted in costly layoffs in some industries. When a subcommittee of the United States Senate looked into the matter, it reported, "In effect, the International Materials Conference, an unauthorized group of persons in other countries, dictated to the United States how much of such critical materials could be allocated to the United States stockpile. the so-called entitlements of consumption, established by the International Materials Conference, created a shortage of critical materials in this country for the benefit of foreign powers. When the Senate received this report, it immediately withdrew authorization for the use of funds to be used in support of the IMC. The executive department under President Eisenhower, however, completely ignored the action and merely diverted the funds from other sources for this purpose. The justification used was that the IMC derived its authority from an executive agreement, a higher source than Congress, and as such must be supported. Some Americans, as they see their country gradually becoming more and more helplessly ensnared in this web of foreign entanglements, seek comfort in the thought that the real power of the United Nations supposedly resides in the Security Council, where we have the right to veto anything that we dislike. As long as this is so, they reason, we have nothing to fear. But these people are in for a rude awakening. For one thing, as we have already pointed out, the Secretariat or full-time staff of the UN wields a dominant influence amounting to virtual effective control from behind the scenes. Aside from that, however, thinking strictly in terms of the theoretical power structure, it is true that the original setup was supposed to place the authority to wage war and other important matters in the hands of the Big Five in the Security Council, each with the protection of a veto. The General Assembly was supposed to be merely a world forum where nations could express their views and pass harmless resolutions. In fact, it is doubtful that the American people would have accepted the United Nations on any other basis. But the UN Charter is a remarkable document and, as we shall see, things are not quite the same today as they were in 1945. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles put it, quote, "If a situation is arrived at where you can't accomplish a reasonable fair result through technical charter amendments, it may very well be possible to agree on procedures which would get a very large part of the desired result. Now, it would be much neater and cleaner to do it by charter amendment, but if that process is frustrated by the fact that the 5 permanent members have the veto power on amendments, then other ways could be found." He said that the United Nations Charter was sufficiently unspecific and flexible to allow evolution in this direction, and concluded that, for this reason, future generations would be thankful to the men at San Francisco who had drafted it. Trygve Lie expressed the same sentiment when he said, quote, "There has been a healthy shift in power from the Council to the veto-free General Assembly. Thus, progress by no means alone depends upon textual revisions of the Charter. A continued liberal construction of the Charter we now have holds out great promise and perhaps is the more practical way to strengthen the bonds of the world community." This philosophy, of course, is not original with Mr. Dulles or Mr. Lee. Centuries earlier, Napoleon wrote, quote, "A constitution should be short and obscure." While the United Nations Charter is anything but short, it certainly is obscure. A smart politician with a flair for legal language could justify almost anything on the basis of its provisions. As Dulles admitted, "I have never seen any proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, or for world government, or for world federation, which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the United Nations Charter." What has all this got to do with our veto in the UN? Simply this: we do not have it anymore. When the United Nations called for military action to repel the communist invasion of South Korea, technically speaking, it was violating the terms of its own charter. This has never slowed the UN down in the past, but this time the issue was important enough to demand the pretense of legality. The difficulty arose due to the Soviets' absence from the Security Council. When the United Nations was formed, it was understood that a Big Five failure to vote was automatically considered a veto. But, due to the flexibility of the Charter and dynamic usage, the practice now is that failure to vote does not constitute a veto. At the time of the Korean invasion, this concept was right in the middle of being evolved, and it was no time to put it to the test. Consequently, at the primary insistence of the US, a unified command was established under theoretical American control, and a Uniting for Peace resolution was introduced before the General Assembly, where it passed with little difficulty. The resolution established the following profound changes in UN procedure. 1. If, due to a veto, the Security Council fails to act in a case of military crisis, the General Assembly can hold an emergency session to take up the matter. 2. In such a case, the General Assembly can call on member nations to make available their armed forces for whatever military action the General Assembly may recommend. Here, then, is one more thread. Loss of the veto is no small matter, as even Trygve Lie was forced to admit, quote, "The Assembly, by adopting the Atchison Plan," which is the Uniting for Peace plan, engineered a profound shift of emergency power from the veto-ridden Security Council to the veto-less General Assembly, a shift the full potentialities of which have still to be realized. It means that at some future date, Uncle Sam will awaken from his long slumber only to find that he is completely at the mercy of a majority vote within a mob of angry Lilliputians screaming for his head, and that the harmless World Forum that he thought he created has transformed itself into an all-powerful world government fully capable of performing the execution. In an apparently calm acceptance of this grim fate for our country, President Lyndon Johnson, continuing to throw his full weight behind the United Nations, nonchalantly stated it this way, quote, "We who stand here in peace and security and prosperity must realize that we are greatly outnumbered in this world, more than 17-1 in population. Criteria and measure yourself by that standard, and you will find that we are in a very small minority." Just 2 months previously, he had said, quote, "In a world of 113 nations, 50 of which have had new governments in the past 3 years, the United States must be prepared for change." That's the end of chapter 16. Change. Everybody likes change. We all know change is good. The Labour Party got elected because they promised to change. One of those incredibly vague terms that could be good, could be bad. They don't tell you. They just say change, right? So it's going to be really interesting to look at what's happened in the US since this book was written. What further agreements have been made, what further silken threads have been wove around the sleeping giant. Just as a heads up to let people know, in case you are new to the channel, that's going to be the subject. This is the next book that we're going to read. This was voted for in the Telegram group, and the Milner-Fabian conspiracy is next. And this was 2012. This came out, and it's going to go all the way back to Lord Milner and his roundtable groups by way of the Fabian Society, all the way up to the present day. And I'm really looking forward to reading through this one. I've dipped in and out, but it's going to tie a lot of what we've already covered on the channel together. I just flicked through it there and I saw it's talking about the Open Conspiracy, which is H.G. Wells' book. We've also read that on this channel already. First book we read on this channel, in fact, that's in the playlist on the YouTube if you want to check that out. So Fabian Freeway and Fearful Master, both published in the 60s, painted a pretty grim picture back then. We've had another 60 years of this plan rolling out pretty much with no opposition, pretty smoothly, I would say. I think the plans are unfolding fairly on time and according to what they want. I don't know if that's a black pill thing or a negative thing, but maybe there's some kind of grand awakening happening, some shift happening, some youthful, rebellious uprising brewing. Perhaps that is the case, but I'm not sure. I'm not. I feel like most people are just comfortable. They've got their Netflix and their smartphones and their junk food delivered to their door. And as long as they can go on holiday once or twice a year, and then they're happy. And I don't think people are very, for the most part, cognizant of the precipice upon which we stand, staring into the abyss of total digital control and slavery over every aspect of our lives. People seem to be sleepwalking into that fairly obliviously, from my point of view, but I'm happy to be corrected. And if anyone else has a different view on that, but it's going to be good to get this book read, and then that, I think that, well, if that's our 10th book, then those 10 books that we've read on the channel will together paint a really good, like, interconnected picture of the agendas and where we're at and where we're going and what the plan is for us as a species, you know. So look forward to that. We're probably going to be starting that in September at some point. But The Fearful Master is quite an eye-opener. I didn't realize that the UN was so communistic and collectivist in nature. I really had no idea, although I should have known. The way they rolled out the Big C event against everybody pretty much on the face of the place, the place where we live. They rolled it out everywhere all at once. That alerted me to the nature of a one world system and a one world government open conspiracy type agenda. But I was not so aware, but also it showed us the collectivist nature of it, wasn't it? Because it was like, stay at home and muzzle yourself and get your experimental injections for the greater good. It's not for your benefit, but it's because if you don't get it, then somebody else might die. So you have to do it for other people. So it was the ultimate test to see who would sacrifice themselves, their autonomy, their bodily autonomy and integrity and individuality for the greater good. And that was the big division that was made. And those who went for it have been identified, and those who didn't go for it have now been identified as well. And, you know, bear that in mind, linking back to the point I made at the intro with this super advanced AI-powered propaganda that's going to be coming at us, probably already is coming at us. Bear it in mind that they know who took the bait and took the offer on the table, and they know who didn't. And right now, it's got to be a case of, well, how do you minimize dissent? How do you minimize pushback? Now you've identified where it's going to come from. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing, isn't it, at the moment now, is these, you know, people being locked up for Facebook posts and sharing things online. Think before you post. We're seeing that now, and it's becoming very overt. The velvet glove is coming off the iron fist, and a lot of people are going to wake up when the door gets kicked in and they have a boot on the neck. That's a really grim black pill place to leave it. But Enfuego says, I believe a big part of Divock 91 was a psychometric test for what they roll out next. Yeah, that was my impression as well. Identify who will roll the sleeve up and who won't. And now they know. So now they've got all that data. They've gathered it, because it's all about data. It's all about testing and gathering data and gathering that intel and feeding it into models and predictions and wargaming the scenarios. And they've got that methodology and technology so advanced now, we probably can't even imagine the scenarios that they can wargame and run through and play out and simulate when it comes to rolling out these plans and schemes and scams. So stay vigilant. Question everything. That's what Last American Vagabond always says, isn't it? Stay vigilant. Question everything. Buy some books. Take some time off the scary feed of information, and invest in yourself and the people around you and the relationships with the people around you on the ground. Because I think there might be a time where we just have to unplug. We've got to unplug and step away from the screens and the microphones and the cameras and just go and be with people in person, playing a board game, singing a song, painting a picture. I don't know, just doing something without screens, you know, try and bake some of that good activity away from the screens and the surveillance technology back into your life. You know, walk the dog, bird watching, go and pick some blueberries or foraging, foraging. That's a good activity. Hiking, these kind of things. Wild swimming, I don't know. Make some time for people who are important to you and spending time in nature away from screens and intense propaganda of crazy things that are going on all over the world, right? Because that's playing into the trap. Trying to be constantly aware of everything that's going on everywhere all the time is playing into what we've just been reading about, this turning you into a global citizen. Like you don't get to relax because of this terrible thing that's happening over on this continent over here. So you need to worry about that and be scared about it and give us some money and donate to help out, right? So we need to unplug from that forced global awareness of things and events, that international view of it, and try and shrink our awareness down a little bit to our local area and our immediate vicinities, and work there to make things good there. Whether that's growing food or helping out neighbors, skill exchanges, building communities, maybe even starting a book club or something. Alan Watt says in one of his talks, get a book, take it around to find someone else who's interested in these things and meet up and read a chapter and talk about what's in the chapter and do it in person. And you only need 2 people. And then before long, word spreads and other people come along, and you can have these in-person meetings where you could be someone's living room. You just read through a chapter. One person reads it out, and then you all kind of discuss what you just read and throw it backwards and forwards and chew on it a little bit. And that would be a way more nourishing way to spend your time than plonking in front of the next episode of whatever TV series is being put out there, for example. So there's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different options. And I suppose in a sense, looking back at what people used to do and trying to resurrect some of those things from the past. It reminds me, I have a book by Neil Postman, which is titled something along those lines. There it is, right there. Building a Bridge to the 18th Century. So Neil Postman, if you don't know, he wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is all about television and entertainment and how it just rots the mind and the relationships and the culture and the society, right? In this book, which I haven't read yet, is about... It says, Postman shows us how to reclaim that balance between mind and machine in a dazzling celebration of the accomplishments of the Enlightenment. Ooh, some people won't like that, will they? I know there'll be people in the audience who don't like the Enlightenment. But I thought it was a good idea. Returning to simpler ways, returning to a slower pace, getting in tune with weather and seasons, whether that's foraging or planting food, keeping some animals maybe. I think these simple things are going to become very important as the creature comforts that we're used to become less and less. So learning to enjoy a sunset, or a sunrise, or a walk in the woods. Some of these simpler joys that we can have in life. The people who can sort of shift gears a little bit and find meaning and joy and purpose in those simpler things, rather than having to have, the gadgets and the gizmos and the hyper normalized reality of online content and social media, Netflix streaming content all the time, bang, 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 TikTok and all that stuff. You want to get out of that, shift gears a little bit into the rhythms and the cycles of nature and your own nature as a human being and the nature around you, the animals and the plants and the weather and the cycles and all that kind of thing. So that's kind of my little bit of advice to end on. So it's not doom and gloom and black-pilled. So thank you all for being here and joining in on the live stream. And thank you for being here if you're watching on the replay. I'm very glad, always uplifting that people tune in and get value from this. We've got a lot of books to get through. So hang in there. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff if you want to help the channel grow and get out to more people who might need this information and who might benefit from slowing down a little bit and taking the time out of their busy lives to read a book and get some information that is not psychologically weaponized, you know, like a lot of the media that we swim in these days. A lot of it is psychological warfare and waged against us and designed to appeal to our subconscious and our different biases and different personalities to walk us down certain paths of thinking and lead us by our emotions, not by our critical thinking and our rational faculties, right? So spread the word if you believe in the channel and what we do here, and you know of someone else who might benefit from it. That would be really lovely. And of course, there's always the allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews, where you can find ways to donate if you would like to. You can find where to subscribe to the channels, which social media I use, and cryptocurrency addresses as well. If you have some of that and you would like to send me some, that would be greatly appreciated too. That is the link. Allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews is pinned on all the chats, I think. So if you need to find it, it's right there at the top of the chat. And it's always there because I always put it there. Yeah, I think that's it. I think earlier in the video I said we'd be back on Saturday, but actually what I meant to say is we'll be back on Thursday to finish off The Fearful Master. The last 30 pages, we got through it pretty quick. It feels like this one went really quickly. I don't know about you, but it's been a pleasure to read, and it's been so packed, and it's just been a smooth, easy ride all the way through. It hasn't like dragged out at all. So Thursday night, 7 p.m, we'll be polishing off the book. We'll broadcast Saturday as well, where we'll go through some of these extras and these goodies that came with it. And there's loads of that to get through, so I don't know which ones we'll do, but I'll pick some of the ones that look interesting. And yeah, that's all I got to say for right now. So take it easy. Very glad, again, as always, to have you all here on the various chats out there. Thank you for taking part. I hope you have a lovely rest of the week. Well, a lovely Wednesday and Thursday, and I'll see you on Thursday night. Okay. Yeah, so take care. The other thing is, if you want to join the mailing list, that would be really good. You can send an email to autonomoususername@gmail.com. I will send you a free gift, and you can join the mailing list and stay in touch just in case. Just in case. I don't think we're going to get banned. I've mentioned it so many times. I've never had a strike. I don't think we're on the radar of channels they need to shut up because we're doing long form content that most people are too, I was going to say dumb, but I don't mean dumb. Most people's attention span is too short to get into what we do here. And I think that makes us kind of safe from the censorship, you know? So yeah, shoot me an email, autonomoususername@gmail.com. I'll put you on the mailing list. Or if you just want to get in touch with suggestions for the show or feedback, good, bad, how I can make it better, all that kind of stuff is very much appreciated. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm also accessible Instagram, Twitter, what's the other one? Telegram. There you go. So we'd love to hear from you anytime. So take it easy. Enjoy yourselves. I'll see you on Thursday. God bless. Bye.